Hello there, and welcome to Just About Earth, where curiosity gets cozy and science takes the scenic route to slumber. Tonight's journey takes us far back in time, farther back than dinosaurs, farther even than the mighty supercontinent called Pangea that many of us learned about in school. But before we start travelling through those ancient landscapes together, I'd like to ask something simple, something grounding. Where are you listening from right now? Maybe it's late at night and you're curled up with a blanket. Maybe it's an early morning with your first cup of tea. Or maybe you've stumbled across this in the middle of the day looking for a moment of calm. Wherever you are, whenever you are, you and I are about to take a quiet walk across Earth's forgotten past. It feels fitting, doesn't it? Here we are, scattered across different places and different times, and yet all of us connected by this one planet under our feet. It has carried us, and all living things before us, through billions of years of change. Continents have collided and split, oceans have formed and drained, climates have frozen and boiled. The world we think we know today is only the most recent face that Earth has worn, and if you find this slow exploration soothing or interesting, or just a nice background for winding down your day, I'd be so grateful if you tapped the like button, maybe even subscribed, because it helps this little corner of calm find its way to others who could use a peaceful pause too. I promise, this isn't the kind of science that's going to jolt you awake with explosions or fast cuts. We're not racing through facts tonight. Instead, we'll stroll, noticing details the way you might notice leaves along a path or stones on the shore. We'll take our time because time is exactly what Earth has had, an almost unimaginable amount of it. So let's begin with something familiar, Pangea. When most people hear that name, they imagine a single vast continent, a puzzle where all the pieces of today's continents fit neatly together. Maybe you've seen the diagrams where South America snuggles against Africa like two long-lost relatives reuniting. Maybe you picture it as the stage where dinosaurs roamed before the continents split and drifted apart again. And that's true, Pangea was real. It existed about 300 million years ago, stretching from pole to pole. But what often gets overlooked is that Pangea was not the first time Earth gathered its lands into one massive continent. Far from it. It was only the most recent. Earth, you see, has a habit of recycling itself. Plates shift, oceans widen, mountains rise and crumble, and over hundreds of millions of years, continents merge into supercontinents, break apart, and merge again. This cycle has happened not once, not twice, but several times across Earth's history. So if Pangea was the latest chapter, what came before? What kind of worlds existed long before dinosaurs, before forests, before complex life even crawled onto land? To answer that, we have to stretch our imaginations farther than usual. The timeframes we'll talk about tonight are vast. Hundreds of millions of years sound enormous. But when you're dealing with the history of Earth, they're just segments, like pages in a very long book. If you condensed Earth's 4.4 billion years into a single 24-hour day, Pangea would appear only in the last few minutes before midnight. And yet, before those final minutes, there were entire worlds that rose and fell, oceans that covered everything, continents that drifted and collided in ways we can barely picture now. And here's where it gets tricky. The deeper into Earth's past we go, the fewer clues remain. Rocks are destroyed, recycled back into the planet's interior, erased by erosion. Fossils vanish. So much of what we know about pre-Pangea Earth comes not from tidy evidence but from hints. Fragments of ancient rock scattered across modern continents, magnetic traces frozen in crystals, chemical whispers hidden in old minerals. Piecing them together is a bit like trying to solve a puzzle where most of the pieces are missing, and the box with the picture on it was lost a long time ago. But bit by bit, scientists have reconstructed enough to give us glimpses of those forgotten worlds. One of those glimpses reveals a supercontinent called Rodinia, which existed about 1.1 billion years ago. Before Rodinia, there was Nuna, also known as Columbia, a giant landmass more than 1.5 billion years old. Still earlier, there was Knorrland, and even farther back, which may have been the first recognisable continent. Tiny compared to what came later, but enormous compared to anything that had existed before it. These names might sound like characters from a fantasy novel, but they're very real markers in the story of our planet. Think about that for a moment. When Pangea existed, the world already had forests, rivers, reptiles, and insects. But when Rodinia existed, there were no trees, no animals on land, no flowers. The world was almost alien. Go farther back to Nuna and Knorrland, and life was even simpler. Mostly microbial, clinging to shorelines or floating in ancient seas. To imagine Earth before Pangea is to imagine a world where continents themselves were the main characters, drifting and colliding on a stage almost empty of the life we're familiar with. And yet, though the stage was bare, the drama was immense. Volcanic eruptions that lasted for millions of years, oceans covering whole continents, ice sheets stretching from pole to pole. Every collision of continents reshaped not just the land but the atmosphere, the oceans, and eventually the course of life itself. Sometimes when we think about history, we picture human history, or maybe the time of dinosaurs, and it feels vast. But Earth's deep past stretches so far beyond that. Human history is just a blink compared to these cycles of supercontinents. Even the dinosaurs, with all their 165 million years of existence, lived and died long after Rodinia broke apart. It makes me wonder, and maybe you too, what Earth felt like then. What the sky looked like without birds. What the land smelled like without flowers. What silence sounded like without the buzz of insects or the calls of animals. And though we can't truly know, we can piece together enough to imagine. And so, as we wander tonight through the landscapes that came before Pangea, keep in mind that Earth has never been static. It's always been in motion, always changing, always reshaping itself in cycles so vast we can barely wrap our minds around them. This isn't just the story of rocks and plates, it's the story of the planet itself, a planet that has worn many faces, some familiar, some utterly alien, long before we arrived to give it names. And now that we've set the stage, let's step into that puzzle of drifting continents and start with the realization that Pangea was not the beginning, but only one of many. When most of us first learn about Earth's history in school, Pangea feels like the big reveal. Teachers pull out a map, slide the continents together like pieces of a jigsaw puzzle, and suddenly South America fits against Africa, North America drifts toward Europe, and India nestles up under Asia. It's almost too neat, too satisfying, the way those coastlines seem designed to lock into place. You can picture it right away, a single giant landmass stretching from pole to pole, wrapped in an enormous ocean. But the real twist is that this was not the first time the planet played this game of continental clustering. Pangea was only the latest round of a cycle that has repeated for billions of years. The reason continents move at all is because Earth's surface is not fixed but restless. Beneath the crust lies a mantle that, over geological timescales, flows like putty. The heat rising from Earth's interior stirs it into slow convection currents, dragging the rigid plates of crust along like rafts on a sluggish sea. This process, known as plate tectonics, constantly reshapes the face of the planet. Ocean basins widen and close, mountains rise and erode, and continents wander thousands of kilometers over millions of years. It is a puzzle in motion, never solved, always rearranging itself. What makes Pangea special to us is that it's the one we can picture most easily. The continents we live on were part of it. The coastlines we know today were once neighbours. There's a familiarity in sliding them back together, like reassembling a broken plate where the cracks still match. But go further back in time, and the pieces don't just fit together differently, they change shape entirely. Coastlines erode, new land emerges, volcanic arcs stitch continents together, rifts tear them apart. The The farther back you go, the harder it becomes to recognise the puzzle at all. Imagine trying to reconstruct a family photo album where half the pages were torn out, others were smudged, and the faces had all changed with age. That's what geologists face when they look beyond Pangea. There are scraps of evidence, fragments of old mountain belts, mineral grains that carry magnetic signatures showing where they once formed. When these clues are pieced together, a pattern emerges. Earth has gathered and scattered its continents many times, in cycles that span hundreds of millions of years. To understand this, think of the way a heartbeat works. The heart contracts, pulling blood inward, and then expands, pushing it outward again. Earth's crust behaves in a somewhat similar rhythm. Continents drift apart, scattered across the globe, then slowly converge again, colliding into supercontinents. Geologists call this the supercontinent cycle. Pangea was simply the most recent contraction, not the first. Before it came Rodinia, before Rodinia came Nuna, before Nuna came Canorland, and before even those there may have been smaller continental seeds like Each cycle reshaped Earth's climate, oceans and life, leaving echoes that we can still trace today. But why do continents clump together at all? After all, if plates move in different directions, wouldn't they just keep scattering endlessly? The answer lies in the geometry of Earth itself. The surface of the planet is curved, limited. When plates drift, they can't avoid eventually colliding somewhere. As oceans widen on one side of the world, others narrow on the opposite side. Eventually, continents that were once far apart are drawn together by the closure of ocean basins, crashing into each other to form towering mountain ranges. Think of the Himalayas, formed by India colliding with Asia. Now multiply that collision across the entire planet. The result is a supercontinent. This has happened again and again, each time reshaping the face of Earth in ways almost unimaginable. For instance, when Rodinia formed around 1.1 billion years ago, it gathered nearly all of Earth's land into one cluster. The vast interior of that supercontinent may have been arid and barren, far from the moderating influence of the ocean. Climate swung between extremes. Later, when Rodinia broke apart, the shifting arrangement of continents may have triggered one of the most severe ice ages in Earth's history, the so-called Snowball Earth episodes, where ice may have covered the entire planet. Nuna, which came even earlier, around 1.6 billion years ago, is harder to picture because the evidence is faint. The rocks from that time are scarce and heavily altered. But what remains suggests that much of the land we know today, parts of North America, Scandinavia, Siberia, India and Australia, were once stitched together into a single continental plate. Its mountains have long eroded away, but the scars are still visible in ancient cratons, the cores of modern continents. Canorland, about 2.7 billion years old, may have been one of the earliest true supercontinents. It formed at a time when Earth's atmosphere was just beginning to change dramatically, as photosynthetic microbes pumped oxygen into the air. Life then was mostly microscopic, yet the movement of continents helped drive the cycles of nutrients that made more complex life possible later. And then there was a name almost mythic, given to what may have been the first recognisable continent at all. Formed nearly 3 billion years ago, was small compared to later giants, perhaps only a fraction of modern Africa's size. Yet it may have persisted, surviving through later collisions, becoming part of larger supercontinents like Rodinia and Pangea. If that's true, then tiny fragments of might still lie beneath our feet today, buried deep in the bedrock of modern continents. The idea that Earth has gone through multiple rounds of continental assembly and breakup didn't always seem obvious. For centuries, people assumed continents were fixed, their shapes and positions eternal. Even after Alfred Wegener proposed continental drift in 1912, suggesting that continents moved over time, many scientists resisted the idea. It wasn't until the 1960s, with the discovery of seafloor spreading and the acceptance of plate tectonics, that the full picture emerged. Suddenly, the drifting puzzle made sense. and with it came the realization that Pangea was only the latest in a long line of continental unions. Think about how strange that is. We often imagine Earth as solid and steady beneath us, the ground we walk on unchanging. Yet over deep time, the very continents are travellers, wandering across the globe, colliding and parting like dancers in a slow, endless waltz. Pangea was one formation, one moment when the dancers all came together, but before that they had gathered many times before. When scientists first reconstructed Pangea, they noticed not just the matching coastlines, but matching fossils and rock formations across continents, now separated by oceans. Identical species of ancient reptiles and plants found in both South America and Africa, mountain chains that lined up perfectly when the continents were joined. Go further back, and the evidence becomes harder to find, but not impossible. The orientations of magnetic minerals in ancient rocks show where they formed relative to Earth's magnetic poles. When those orientations are compared across continents, patterns emerge that reveal how the pieces once fit together. It is from this painstaking work that the older supercontinents have been reconstructed, ghostly shapes in the geological record. The puzzle, then, is not just that continents drift and collide, but that they have done so for billions of years, shaping the very environment in which life evolved. Without the collisions that built mountain ranges, erosion wouldn't have delivered nutrients to the seas. Without the opening and closing of the oceans, climates might never have shifted enough to drive adaptation and diversity. In a way, the restless dance of continents is one of the reasons life on Earth is as rich and varied as it is today. When we think of Pangea, it feels like a singular event, a once-in-history formation. But really it was part of a much larger cycle, one that continues even now. The continents we know today are still moving. The Atlantic Ocean is widening as North America drifts away from Europe and Africa. The Pacific is slowly shrinking. Millions of years from now, a new supercontinent will form, sometimes nicknamed Pangea Proxima, when today's scattered lands converge again. In other words, the puzzle is never solved, only rearranged. So the story of Pangea is not just the story of one continent, but of a repeating cycle. Earth before Pangea was not empty or formless. It was full of other supercontinents, other configurations, other climates and histories. Each one left traces that shaped what came next. And if we follow those traces, we begin to glimpse worlds that no human eye has ever seen, but that still shape the planet we walk on today. If you look at a modern world map for long enough, it almost feels alive. The continents don't quite seem like they're frozen in place, more like they've been caught mid-step in a very long dance. South America leans toward Africa like an old friend who once lived next door. Australia looks as if it's trying to slip quietly out the back door. And Antarctica sits at the bottom of the globe like someone who wandered too far south at a party and never came back. Of course the map is still, but what it shows us is only a snapshot. The continents are never truly still. They drift, slowly but steadily, over spans of time far longer than any civilization or even any species has existed. This wandering nature of Earth's lands is easy to forget because we move on such short scales. 100 years, 1,000 years, even 10,000 years is nothing to a continent. You could watch a coastline every day for your entire life, and it would look unchanged. Yet given millions of years, those same coastlines creep, shuffle and stretch. Oceans widen and close, mountain ranges rise, erode and rise again somewhere else. It's all happening so slowly that it escapes ordinary notice. But from the planet's perspective, the continents have never been still for long. Scientists call this process plate tectonics, and though it's taught in school now, it was once a controversial idea. When Alfred Wegener first suggested continental drift in the early 20th century, many dismissed it as speculation. The idea that entire continents could slide across the globe seemed outrageous. It wasn't until the 1960s when evidence from the ocean floor revealed new crust forming along mid-ocean ridges and magnetic patterns showing seafloor spreading, that the theory was accepted. Suddenly, the wandering continents were no longer speculation, they were reality, and the story of Earth's moving lands could finally be told. But this story doesn't just stretch back to Pangea, the supercontinent everyone knows. It extends much deeper into time. Long before Pangea, other supercontinents came and went, and before those, even smaller landmasses drifted and collided in ways that shaped the very crust of the planet. If you could rewind Earth's history like a film, you'd see the continents constantly in motion. Rewind far enough, and you'd watch familiar shapes melt into unfamiliar ones. Coastlines merging into land masses that no longer exist. Seas disappearing into mountain belts. Entire continents breaking apart into scattered fragments that look nothing like the world map we know. Think of the continents as travellers with long and complicated itineraries. Sometimes they move apart and explore on their own, drifting across wide oceans. Other times they converge, gathering into crowded reunions that last for hundreds of millions of years. Each cycle leaves behind scars in the rocks, and those scars are how we know where they've been. Ancient mountain ranges, long since eroded down to their roots, tell stories of collisions between lands now far apart. For example, the Appalachian Mountains in North America share a history with ranges in Scotland and Scandinavia, a reminder that those continents once touched before the Atlantic Ocean opened. Deep time wandering has also left clues in the minerals themselves. When volcanic rocks form, tiny crystals within them align with Earth's magnetic field. As the rocks cool, those alignments freeze in place, like tiny compass needles recording the latitude where the rock solidified. Billions of years later, geologists can measure those magnetic signals and reconstruct where the continent once sat. Piece enough of these clues together and you get a trail showing continents drifting across latitudes, sometimes from pole to equator and back again. And what a trail it is. Consider the small continent of India. Today it juts south into the Indian Ocean, but rewind 100 million years and you'd find it down near the southern pole, part of a larger landmass called Gondwana. From there it drifted northward at remarkable speed, colliding with Asia about 50 million years ago. That collision is still ongoing, crumpling up the Himalayas higher every year. Stand at the base of Mount Everest and you're standing on limestone that once lay at the bottom of a tropical ocean, lifted skyward by wandering lands crashing together. India is just one example, but it shows how continents carry their past with them. The rocks beneath your feet might have travelled thousands of kilometres since they first formed. They might once have been part of a mountain range that's long gone, or a seafloor that closed when continents collided. In that sense, every continent is a palimpsest, layers of history written and rewritten as they wander across the globe. Before Pangea, this wandering produced supercontinents like Rodinia, Nuna, and Kenorland. Rodinia, which existed about 1 billion years ago, may have gathered nearly all of Earth's land into one cluster. Scientists think its breakup around 750 million years ago set the stage for dramatic climate shifts, including global glaciations. Nuna, which existed even earlier around 1.6 billion years ago, pulled together parts of what are now North America, Scandinavia and Australia. Kenorland, older still, may have formed 2.7 billion years ago, in an Earth almost unrecognisable to us. What makes this fascinating is not just that the continents wandered, but that their wandering shaped life itself. When continents cluster into supercontinents, the climate shifts dramatically. The interiors of those giant landmasses are far from the ocean, often dry and extreme. When continents break apart, new coastlines appear. Shallow seas spread across the land and biodiversity tends to flourish. It's as if life responds to the rhythm of the wandering lands, expanding and contracting with the continents themselves. Even the chemistry of the oceans is influenced by this motion. When continents collide, mountain ranges rise and erosion delivers nutrients into the sea. That fertilization can spark blooms of life. When continents split apart, volcanic activity along rift zones can release carbon dioxide, warming the climate. Over deep time, these processes have helped drive mass extinctions and bursts of diversification alike. It's also worth remembering that the continents themselves didn't exist in their current form early on. Billions of years ago, Earth's crust was thinner and hotter, and land was small and fragmented. The first true continents were tiny compared to today, just islands of stable crust floating in a vast ocean. Those early fragments slowly grew as volcanic arcs and colliding plates welded more material onto their edges. Wandering across deep time didn't just move continents around, it built them up from seeds into giants. This makes the idea of ancient Earth's wandering lands even more striking. It wasn't just that they shifted positions, they changed identities. What started as a small proto-continent called may have survived in pieces, joining larger land masses, breaking away and merging again. The continents we know today are mosaics, patchwork stitched together from many past wanderers. If you could look at Earth 3 billion years ago, you might see scattered volcanic islands dotting a global ocean, with only a few small patches of true continent rising above the waves. Jump forward 1 billion years and those patches would have gathered into Canorland. Wait another billion and you'd see Nuna, then Rodinia, then Pangea. At each step, the map of Earth looked radically different, yet always in motion, always restless. And of course, the wandering hasn't stopped. Africa is slowly drifting northward into Europe. Australia is heading toward Asia. California, riding on the Pacific Plate, is inching its way northwest at a pace of a few centimetres per year. It may not sound like much, but given tens of millions of years, it's enough to redraw coastlines and create new mountains. In that sense, the map we know today is temporary, just another frame in a film that has been playing for billions of years. To think of Earth this way is to see it less as a static planet and more as a living system, always reshaping itself. The wandering lands carry not just rocks and mountains, but the entire history of climate and life on their backs. Every step they take across deep time leaves a mark, and those marks add up to the world we inhabit now. And as we drift through this thought, it's worth remembering that what lies ahead is another cycle. Millions of years from now, the continents we know will converge again into a new supercontinent. The wandering never ends. If Pangea is the supercontinent most of us know, then Rodinia is the one that hides in the background, a name that rarely comes up outside of geology books, but represents one of the most important and mysterious chapters in Earth's story. It existed more than 1 billion years ago, long before animals, long before forests, long before life had even figured out how to build shells or skeletons. And yet it gathered nearly all of Earth's land into a single cluster, shaping the planet in ways that would echo for hundreds of millions of years afterward. Rodinia's name comes from the Russian word for motherland, which feels appropriate, because in many ways it was a birthplace of geological processes and environmental changes that set the stage for what came later. It formed about 1.1 billion years ago, during a time when Earth was already more than 3 billion years old. Continents had been colliding and breaking apart since the planet cooled enough to form crust. But Rodinia was one of the largest and most stable unions of land the world had yet seen. Of course, no one was around to see it. There were no animals to wander across its surface, no trees to mark the passing of seasons, no flowers to bloom and fade. Life at that time was microscopic, mostly bacteria and algae, tiny forms floating in the oceans or forming thin mats along shorelines. So when we picture Rodinia, we have to strip away everything familiar about a living landscape. No birds in the sky, no grass underfoot, no insects buzzing. Only bare rock, volcanic eruptions, shallow seas, and skies tinted by the chemistry of an atmosphere still adjusting to the presence of oxygen. How do we even know it existed if it was so long ago and so lifeless? The answer is written in the rocks. Scattered across today's continents are ancient cratons, the stable cores of continental crust that have survived billions of years of tectonic upheaval. By studying their ages, compositions, and especially the magnetic signatures frozen within them, scientists can reconstruct where those pieces once sat relative to Earth's poles. When they line up the evidence from North America, Siberia, Australia, China, and other regions, a pattern emerges. Around 1.1 billion years ago, those pieces fit together into a single landmass, Rodinia. Unlike Pangea, which stretched across much of Earth's surface in a way that seems obvious when you slide today's continents together, Rodinia's shape is harder to picture. Scientists debate exactly how it was arranged. Some reconstructions place North America at the centre, surrounded by fragments that would become parts of South America, Africa, and Australia. Others suggest different orientations, with continents swapped or rotated. The problem is that the rocks have been through so much since then. Collisions, rifts, erosion, and metamorphism have scrambled the evidence. Trying to reconstruct Rodinia is like trying to reassemble a painting after it's been shredded, burned, and patched back together. Still, enough hints remain that we can be confident it existed, even if the details of its geography are still argued over. What makes Rodinia so significant isn't just its existence, but the timing. During the billion years around its lifespan, Earth went through dramatic changes. The atmosphere became more oxygen-rich, thanks to photosynthetic microbes pumping out oxygen as a waste product. That oxygen didn't just fill the air. It reacted with minerals, altered the chemistry of oceans, and gradually made the planet more hospitable for future complex life. Rodinia, by clustering continents together, played a role in that story. Large supercontinents affect climate in ways smaller continents can't. When land gathers into a single mass, its interior becomes dry, far from the moderating influence of the ocean. Winds can't carry much moisture into the heart of a continent that stretches thousands of kilometres from coast to coast. So the middle of Rodinia may have been a barren desert, while the edges hosted shallow seas and microbial mats. Temperature extremes were likely more severe, with hot summers and cold winters, though the planet overall may have been warmer than today thanks to high levels of greenhouse gases. But Rodinia didn't last forever. Like every supercontinent, it eventually began to break apart, and that breakup had profound consequences. Starting around 750 million years ago, rifts opened and new oceans formed, tearing Rodinia into pieces. As the continents drifted apart, their positions relative to the equator and poles changed, altering ocean circulation and climate patterns. It's during this time that Earth may have entered one of its most extreme climate states, the so-called snowball Earth, when ice sheets possibly extended all the way to the equator. Scientists still debate how complete that glaciation was. Some think the planet froze over entirely, oceans covered by kilometres of ice, with only thin films of liquid water surviving near volcanic vents. Others argue it was more of a slush ball, with belts of open water near the equator. Either way, the connection to Rodinia is strong. The breakup of such a massive landmass would have released huge amounts of carbon dioxide and nutrients, altered weathering rates, and shifted the balance of greenhouse gases. Those changes likely tipped Earth into ice ages that were unlike anything before or since. Imagine that for a moment. A world already strange and barren suddenly locked in ice. No forest to fall silent, no animals to shiver, no cities to vanish. Only an alien landscape of glaciers grinding over rock, frozen oceans stretching toward the horizon, and microbial life clinging on in tiny refuges. And yet from that frozen crucible came resilience. Life survived, adapted, and when the ice finally retreated, it set the stage for the first true explosion of complex multicellular organisms not long after. So in a way, Rodinia's story is not just geological, it's biological. By forming and breaking apart, it may have created the environmental stresses that pushed life toward a greater complexity. It's one of those moments where geology and biology intertwine, reminding us that continents are not just backdrops for life, but active players in its drama. There's also a humbling thought here. If Rodinia hadn't formed, if it hadn't broken apart when it did, if the climate shifts had been slightly different, the trajectory of life on Earth might have been entirely altered. Perhaps complex life would have arisen later, or in a different form, or maybe not at all. Our very existence is tied to the restless movement of continents billions of years before our species appeared. Standing on a modern coastline, it's hard to imagine such deep time. The waves lap against the shore, the horizon feels eternal, and the rocks underfoot seem solid and permanent. But those same rocks may once have been part of Rodinia, then part of other supercontinents, carried across the globe on tectonic rafts. When you pick up a pebble, you may be holding a traveller that has wandered for over 1 billion years. Rodinia is often called a forgotten world, not because it wasn't important, but because it lies so far back in time that it doesn't fit easily into our imagination. We can picture dinosaurs roaming Pangea because we know dinosaurs, we've seen their skeletons. We can imagine the split of Pangea because we see the continents drifting today. But 1 billion years ago, when Rodinia ruled the planet, there were no familiar landmarks. It was a world of rock and microbes, shaped by forces we rarely notice in daily life, but that never stop working. And just as Pangea eventually broke apart, so did Rodinia. The fragments scattered, regrouped, and eventually formed other supercontinents like Gondwana and Laurentia, each leaving its own mark on Earth's history. The cycle continues, and it always will, until the planet cools enough to still its tectonic heart. Thinking about Rodinia reminds us that Earth has worn many faces. The world we know is temporary, a moment in a much longer story. Continents will continue to wander, oceans will open and close, climates will swing from warm to frozen and back again. In that endless cycle, Rodinia was one forgotten but essential act. And as we leave behind this glimpse of Rodinia, the motherland of continents, it leads us naturally to wonder about the worlds that came before it, the older supercontinents that laid the groundwork for its formation, and the wandering lands that stitched themselves together long before Pangea was ever dreamed of. If Rodinia was a great forgotten land, then Nuna, also known as Columbia, was its even older ancestor, a supercontinent that came together almost 2 billion years ago. It was one of the earliest times Earth managed to gather most of its continental pieces into a single vast landmass. And though the details are fuzzy, its existence is written in the rocks that survive today. Imagine a world where there were no trees, no animals, not even shells on the beach, just microbial mats along shorelines and single-celled life drifting in the seas. Into that barren world rose a continent so large it rivaled anything that came after, the first of the giant clusters that we might reasonably call a supercontinent. The name Columbia was given because one of the first reconstructions placed much of what is now North America at its centre, and geologists often like to ground ancient ideas in familiar geography. Others prefer Nuna, from a word meaning land, and the two names are used almost interchangeably. What matters more than the name, though, is the scale. Columbia stretched across a huge portion of Earth's surface, linking the cratons of North America, Greenland, Baltica, Siberia, India, Australia, and South America. The exact arrangement is still debated, but the evidence points strongly to a single, united landmass, about 1.8 to 1.5 billion years ago. Getting a picture of such a distant past is not easy. The rocks from that era have been altered, folded, and buried many times since, but geologists rely on several kinds of clues. One is the alignment of ancient mountain belts, zones where continents once collided. The roots of those mountains can still be found today, exposed as belts of metamorphic rock that match across different continents. For example, mountain remnants in Canada line up with ones in Greenland and Northern Europe, suggesting they were once joined. Another clue comes from paleomagnetism, the record of Earth's magnetic field frozen in minerals as they cooled. When those orientations are compared across continents, they can show whether lands once shared the same latitude and orientation. Together, these clues sketch out the outline of Columbia. Life at the time was still mostly microbial, but the geological changes of Nuna's assembly shaped the environment in ways that would ripple forward. When continents collide, mountains rise and erosion delivers nutrients into the sea. Those nutrients feed microbes, which in turn alter the chemistry of the atmosphere. There's evidence that during Nuna's time, oxygen levels rose to new heights, an event often called the boring billion, because from a biological perspective things seemed stable and slow. But boring is misleading. While evolution may have crawled at a leisurely pace, the stage was being set for future leaps. Large stable continents provided shallow seas along their edges, places where microbial life could thrive and diversify. If you stood on Nuna, what would you have seen? The land itself might have been stark. Bare rock, scattered volcanic plateaus, perhaps thin soils supporting only microbial crusts. No grass to soften the ground, no trees to offer shade. The sky might have been tinted differently too, with a sun weaker than today and an atmosphere still adjusting to rising oxygen levels. The oceans, however, were alive with microbial mats and colonies of cyanobacteria, some of which built stromatolites, layered rock structures that can still be found in places like Western Australia today. They were the forests of their time, silent builders of oxygen. Climate under Nuna would have been shaped heavily by its size. With so much land gathered together, the interior regions may have been dry and harsh, far from the moderating effect of the sea. Rainfall would have been limited, and large deserts could have stretched across the interior. Along the coasts, shallow seas likely flourished, cradling microbial ecosystems. Volcanic activity would have been frequent, especially along rift zones and subduction boundaries, releasing gases that influenced the climate. Earth's surface temperature probably ran warmer than today, though cycles of glaciation may have punctuated the long stability. Building such a supercontinent was no small feat. It took millions of years of collisions as smaller continents and cratons drifted together. The scars of those collisions still exist in some of the world's oldest rocks, in Canada's Shield, in the Amazonian Craton, in Siberia's ancient cores. There are belts of granite and metamorphic rock that record the immense pressures and heat of Nuna's formation. Geologists read these like pages of a book, reconstructing a story that otherwise would be lost. The breakup of Nuna began perhaps 1.5 billion years ago. Rifts opened, new ocean basins formed, and the land fragments drifted apart, only to later recombine in different configurations. This cycle of assembly and breakup seems to be a fundamental rhythm of Earth's geology. Every few 100 million years the continents draw together, collide, then scatter again. Nuna was one of the earliest iterations of this cycle that we can identify with some certainty. Why does this cycle happen at all? The answer lies in plate tectonics and the finite surface of Earth. As new crust forms at mid-ocean ridges, old crust is consumed at subduction zones. The motions of the plates ensure that eventually ocean basins close, bringing continents together. But the system never rests. Once a supercontinent forms, heat builds up beneath it in the mantle, weakening the crust until it begins to rift apart again. It's a balance of forces, convergence and divergence, creation and destruction, endlessly repeating. Nuna's significance goes beyond geology. The stability of large continental platforms provided a base for the slow oxygenation of the atmosphere. It also helped stabilize climate, even if only temporarily, giving microbial ecosystems the chance to expand. And perhaps most importantly, it laid down vast mineral deposits, including banded iron formations and other resources that would later be critical to human civilization. We often think of supercontinents only in terms of geography, but they also shape the economic geology of the planet. Many of the world's richest ore deposits were formed during ancient cycles of supercontinent assembly. When we compare Nuna to Rodinia and Pangea, we see both continuity and change. All three gathered the land into a single cluster, yet each did so under different atmospheric and biological conditions. Nuna came together in a world almost devoid of visible life, Rodinia in a world on the cusp of complex multicellularity, Pangea in a world already bustling with forests, reptiles and insects. Each supercontinent interacted with life differently, shaping and being shaped in return. The thought that Nuna existed 2 billion years ago is almost staggering. That's more than 10 times older than the age of the dinosaurs, hundreds of times older than humanity. It sits so far back in time that it challenges our imagination, and yet without it, the chain of events leading to us might have been very different. The oxygenation it helped support, the stability it provided, the geological resources it laid down, all these were stepping stones on the path to the present. When we talk about forgotten worlds, Nuna may be the most forgotten of all. Rodinia at least is tied to the dramatic snowball Earth events, Pangea to the dinosaurs, and the split that gave us the continents we know. But Nuna lies deeper, quieter, less dramatic in some ways, yet foundational. It reminds us that Earth's history is not just about the spectacular, but also about the slow, the patient, the enduring. Standing on a rocky outcrop today, you might not realise you're standing on the bones of Nuna, but somewhere in that bedrock lies the memory of collisions long gone, of mountains that rose and vanished before animals ever walked the earth. The wandering lands of that time may be unrecognisable now, but they are part of the foundation we live on. And just as Nuna gave way to Rodinia, so Rodinia would later give way to Pangea. The cycle of assembly and breakup continued, as it always has, as it still does today. Continents never rest, and with each rearrangement, Earth writes a new chapter in its story. And so, as we leave behind Nuna, the earliest of the giant supercontinents, our attention turns to what came before even that. The patchwork worlds of Knorland and where the first stirrings of continental life began, and where the seeds of all later lands were planted. Long before Nuna and Rodinia, before even the thought of Pangea, the Earth gathered its land into a form we call Knorland. It's one of those names that feels half mythical, as if it belongs more to legend than geology, and in a way that's fitting. Knorland existed so far back in time, nearly 2.7 billion years ago, that much of the evidence for it has been erased, buried, or altered beyond easy recognition. When scientists speak of Knorland, they do so with cautious confidence, piecing together faint clues from some of the oldest rocks on the planet. And yet, for all its uncertainty, Knorland stands as one of the earliest true supercontinents, a milestone in Earth's long, wandering history. To place yourself in that time is to enter a world almost alien. The sun was dimmer, shining at only about 3/4 of the strength we know today. The atmosphere was different too, rich in gases that would seem toxic to us, with oxygen only just beginning to make its mark thanks to photosynthetic microbes. There were no plants, no animals, no forests. Land was barren, coated in rock, sand, and perhaps thin films of microbial life clinging stubbornly to the edges of lakes and seas. The oceans, on the other hand, were teeming with single-celled organisms, including the cyanobacteria that were quietly altering the course of the planet by releasing oxygen. Knorland itself was a patchwork, a fusion of several ancient cratons, the stable cores of continents that formed early in Earth's history. Pieces that would one day become part of North America, Scandinavia, Southern Africa, and Western Australia all seem to have been stitched together in this early landmass. The collisions that brought them together left behind some of the world's oldest mountain belts, now eroded down to bare roots, but still visible in ancient shields of rock. When geologists study those rocks, they find signatures of the immense pressures and heat that mark the welding of Knorland. What makes Knorland especially important is that it formed during a time of profound planetary change. Around 2.4 billion years ago, Earth experienced what scientists call the Great Oxidation Event. Before that time, oxygen produced by cyanobacteria was quickly consumed by chemical reactions with iron and other elements. But as continents like Knorland provided more shallow seas and weathering delivered more nutrients, microbial life flourished, pumping oxygen into the atmosphere faster than it could be absorbed. The result was a tipping point. Oxygen levels rose sharply, transforming the chemistry of the oceans and atmosphere. The consequences were dramatic. Iron dissolved in the oceans reacted with oxygen and precipitated out, forming vast banded iron formations, striking layers of red and black rock that are still mined today for iron ore. Methane, once a major greenhouse gas, was destroyed by oxygen, leading to global cooling. This may have triggered some of the earliest known ice ages, sometimes called the Huronian glaciations, where ice sheets spread across large parts of the planet. Knorland, in other words, was a witness to Earth's first great oxygen crisis, a time when life itself changed the planet's surface and climate in ways that would shape everything to come. Imagine standing on Knorland during that time, if such a thing had been possible. The landscape would have been quiet, no sound of insects, no rustling leaves, only wind across rock and waves along empty shores. The air would not have been breathable for us, though it was just beginning to shift in that direction. The skies might have carried a different hue, tinted by the chemistry of gases unfamiliar to our senses. Rivers would have cut across barren terrain, carrying sediments into shallow seas where microbial mats spread like carpets. In those mats, tiny cells churned away, creating oxygen, unaware that they were rewriting the planet's future. For millions of years, Knorland held together, a vast experiment in continental unity. But like all supercontinents, it could not last. Eventually, rifting tore it apart. The breakup of Knorland, beginning around 2.5 billion years ago, opened new oceans and scattered its fragments across the globe. Those fragments later drifted into new configurations, some joining to form Nuna, others wandering independently for a time. The breakup may have been fueled by the heat trapped beneath the massive landmass, building pressure until the crust split open. It's a cycle we see repeated throughout Earth's history: assembly, stability, rifting and dispersal. The influence of Knorland didn't end with its breakup. The oxygenation event it helped drive changed the course of evolution. Many anaerobic organisms, those that thrived without oxygen, found themselves poisoned by the new atmosphere. Some retreated to niches where oxygen was scarce, while others vanished altogether. At the same time, the rise of oxygen opened the door for new metabolic strategies, eventually leading to more complex life. Though that complexity would take another billion years to appear, the groundwork was laid in the time of Knorland. From a geological perspective, Knorland also helped create the building blocks of modern continents. The collisions that assembled it thickened the crust, creating stable continental roots that still survive today. Those roots, known as cratons, are among the oldest pieces of Earth's surface. They form the bedrock of regions like the Canadian Shield, the Kapval Craton in South Africa, and the Pilbara Craton in Australia. Without those ancient keystones, later continents might never have had stable platforms on which to grow. One of the most fascinating aspects of Knorland is how much of it we infer rather than see directly. Because it existed so long ago, direct evidence is scarce. Rocks have been recycled, metamorphosed, or eroded away. What survives are fragments, clues scattered across the modern world. Geologists have to act like detectives, piecing together these clues into a plausible reconstruction. Sometimes the pieces fit neatly, sometimes they don't, and debates continue about the exact arrangement. But whether every detail is right or not, the broad picture is clear. By 2.7 billion years ago, Earth had gathered its lands into one of the first supercontinents. This raises an interesting thought about the cycle of supercontinents. If Knorland was among the first, was it also the beginning of a rhythm that continues to this day? Or had earlier, smaller supercontinents come and gone, leaving so little trace that we can only guess at their existence? Some researchers suggest there may have been even older assemblies, sometimes given names like Valbera or tiny proto-continents that predated Kenorland. If that's true, then Kenorland was not the first step, but the first we can see clearly enough to recognise. The name itself, Kenorland, comes from the Kenoran orogeny, a mountain-building event recorded in Canadian rocks that formed as part of the supercontinent's assembly. Naming it after that event is a reminder of how our knowledge comes from fragments, from the places where ancient geology has been preserved well enough to tell a story. Much of the rest is lost, recycled into Earth's mantle, gone without a trace. And yet, even with such limited evidence, Kenorland's importance shines through. It was a land of firsts, one of the first truly global landmasses, a witness to the first major oxygenation of the atmosphere, a participant in some of the earliest known ice ages, a foundation for the cratons that still underlie our continents today. Without it, the story of Earth would look very different. Thinking about Kenorland stretches our sense of time almost to its breaking point. 2.7 billion years ago is not just distant, it's almost incomprehensible. Human history barely scratches the last few thousand years. Even the age of dinosaurs only reaches back about 230 million years. Kenorland predates them by more than 10 times over. It is so far removed that it feels mythical, and maybe that's why the name suits it so well. It reminds us that Earth's history is deeper and stranger than we often imagine. And as Kenorland eventually gave way to breakup, scattering its pieces to form the seeds of Nuna, it continued the cycle of assembly and dispersal that defines Earth's continents. The wandering never stops, and each step lays the groundwork for the next. From Kenorland, we trace the story further back still, toward the even smaller and more fragile proto-continents like where the very first experiments in continental crust began, tiny sparks of land that would eventually grow into the giants we've been following. Long before Kenorland, Nuna, Rodinia, and certainly before Pangea, there may have been a continent so small and so ancient that it feels almost mythical in its own right. Geologists call it a name chosen because in many languages it simply means the first, or the beginning. And that's what seems to have been, the earliest proto-continent that we can reasonably identify in Earth's story. While later supercontinents stretched across vast portions of the globe, was modest by comparison, perhaps only a quarter the size of Africa. But for all its smallness, it played a role far larger than its dimensions suggest, because it might have been the seed from which later continents grew. To place in time, we have to step back almost 3 billion years, into what geologists call the Archean Eon. Earth at that point was already 1.5 billion years old, but it was still a restless, fiery world. The mantle was hotter, the crust thinner, volcanic activity more intense. Oceans covered most of the surface, steaming and churning under a younger sun that shone more dimly than ours does today. Land was scarce, fragmented, and unstable, often swallowed back into the interior by the planet's convulsions. In that unstable setting, a piece of crust thick enough and stable enough to persist would have been extraordinary. May have been one of the first of those pieces. We don't have a map of What we have are fragments, ancient rocks preserved in cratons scattered across modern continents. The Kapval Craton in South Africa, the Pilbara Craton in Western Australia, and other pieces in India and Madagascar may all carry pieces of in their foundations. These rocks are among the oldest on Earth, dating back 3 billion years or more. They are the survivors, these stubborn remnants that escaped recycling into the mantle and still sit at the heart of modern continents. By comparing their ages, compositions and magnetic signatures, geologists can infer that they once formed part of a coherent landmass. What would it have looked like? Certainly nothing like the continents we know. There were no forests, no animals, not even moss or lichen to soften the rocks. The land may have been barren, with only thin microbial crusts spreading across its surfaces, The seas around it would have been alive with single-celled organisms, including cyanobacteria slowly producing oxygen. But the atmosphere at that time was still largely devoid of oxygen, rich instead in methane and carbon dioxide. The skies may have carried a hazy tint, and the climate may have swung between extremes depending on volcanic activity and greenhouse gas concentrations. Was tiny, but its importance lies in its persistence. While earlier proto-continents may have existed and vanished, swallowed back into the mantle without a trace, seems to have survived. And by surviving, it became a nucleus. Later collisions with other land masses stitched additional pieces of crust onto it, growing it into larger continents, and eventually into supercontinents like Knorland, Nuna, and Rodinia. In this sense, is less a continent we can picture clearly, and more a seed crystal, the beginning around which later land accreted. It's worth pausing to consider how remarkable this survival was. Earth's surface is constantly recycled. Oceanic crust forms at mid-ocean ridges and sinks back into the mantle at subduction zones within a couple of 100 million years. Continental crust is different, thicker and more buoyant, harder to subduct. But in the early, hotter Earth, even continents were at risk of being destroyed. For a piece of land to endure for 3 billion years, resisting the churn of tectonics is astonishing. The fact that may still lie buried in the hearts of modern continents is a testament to the resilience of continental crust. The story of is also tied to the story of life. Shallow seas along its coasts would have provided fertile ground for microbial mats, sheltered from the open ocean's turbulence. Weathering of its rocks would have released nutrients into those seas, feeding microbial blooms. In turn, those microbes released oxygen, slowly changing the atmosphere. Though oxygen levels remained low for hundreds of millions of years, the process had begun, and very existence may have helped sustain it by creating stable environments for microbial ecosystems to flourish. Scientists sometimes debate whether was truly the first continent, or whether it was simply the first we can still identify. It's possible that earlier, smaller landmasses existed but left no trace. Names like Valbara are occasionally proposed for hypothetical proto-continents, even older than based on hints in ancient rocks. But those reconstructions are tentative, more speculation than consensus. Stands out because its fragments are more widely recognised, more consistently dated, more clearly pointing to a real ancient landmass. It may not have been alone, but it was one of the first to leave a mark strong enough to survive billions of years of geological upheaval. When we think of Earth's continents, we tend to imagine them as familiar shapes: Africa, Asia, the Americas. But deep in their foundations lie the fragments of The Kapval Craton, for example, forms the geological heart of southern Africa, stable and ancient. The Pilbara Craton underlies a wide swathe of Australia, equally ancient. These places are not just old rocks, they are pieces of Earth's first land, carried forward through time. In a sense, when you walk on them, you are standing on What fascinates many scientists about is how it illustrates the continuity of Earth's cycles. Continents form, break apart, collide, and reform. But they also build on what came before. May have been small, but it provided the foundation for everything that followed. Knorland built upon it, Nuna built upon Knorland, Rodinia built upon Nuna, Pangea built upon all of them. Each supercontinent carried fragments of its predecessors, stitched together into new patterns. Even today, as continents drift toward future collisions that may form another supercontinent millions of years from now, the ancient heart of will still be there, hidden but present, part of the mosaic. There's also something humbling in the fact that we can only glimpse through scattered clues. The rocks that survive are often altered by heat and pressure, transformed into new forms, and yet within them lie isotopic signatures that reveal their age, minerals that carry the imprint of ancient conditions, magnetic grains that record the latitude where they formed. Reading those rocks is like listening to whispers across billions of years. It requires patience, creativity, and sometimes a willingness to accept uncertainty. But the fact that we can hear those whispers at all is extraordinary. If Ur could be seen today as it was then, it might look unremarkable, a cluster of barren land surrounded by vast oceans. Yet in its modesty lay its significance. Without Ur, later continents might never have gained the stability to endure. Without Ur, shallow seas might have been fewer, microbial ecosystems less widespread, oxygen slower to rise. Without Ur, the stage for life as we know it might not have been set. So while it was tiny, while it carried no forests or animals, while it might have seemed almost invisible in the grand scale of the planet, Ur was the quiet beginning of the continents we walk on today. Its fragments still endure, carrying in their silence the story of Earth's first experiment with land. And from Ur, the story continues. Continents would grow larger, climates more complex, life more ambitious. The cycle of assembly and breakup would repeat, gathering the fragments into Knorland, then Nuna, then Rodinia, then Pangea, and beyond. Each step layered upon the last, each carrying traces of that first tiny land that started it all. When you look at the continents today, it's tempting to think of them as permanent. Africa seems eternal, South America seems fixed, Asia stretches vast and immovable. But beneath that sense of stability lies a truth that geologists have pieced together only in the last century. Nothing about Earth's surface is permanent. Continents wander, oceans open and close, and over immense spans of time, they come together and break apart in a repeating cycle. This cycle is called the supercontinent cycle, and it is one of the most profound rhythms of the planet. To understand it, imagine Earth's crust as a giant cracked eggshell. Those cracks are the tectonic plate boundaries, and the plates themselves float on the slowly moving mantle below. New crust forms along mid-ocean ridges, where magma rises and spreads outward. Old crust sinks back into the mantle at subduction zones, where one plate slides beneath another. The balance of these processes keeps the surface in motion. Continents ride on the plates, carried along by the flow of the mantle like rafts on a slow current. Over tens to hundreds of millions of years, these motions change the map of the planet. Sometimes continents are scattered widely, separated by vast oceans. Other times they are pulled together, colliding into a single massive landmass. When all or most of Earth's continents gather into one, we call it a supercontinent. And like a heartbeat, the cycle repeats. Supercontinents form, exist for a time, then break apart again, only to reform in a new configuration. Pangea is the most famous example, but it was not the first and will not be the last. Before Pangea came Rodinia, before Rodinia came Nuna, before Nuna came Knorland, and perhaps before that came Ur and other smaller assemblies. Each had its own lifespan, its own breakup, its own legacy. The timescale is vast, typically 400 to 600 million years between formations. But across Earth's 4.5 billion year history, that means several full cycles have already occurred. Why does this cycle happen? The answer lies in the mechanics of plate tectonics. When a supercontinent forms, it acts like a giant insulating blanket over the mantle. Heat builds up beneath it, unable to escape easily. Eventually, that trapped heat weakens the crust, rifting begins, and the land splits apart. New ocean basins open, pushing the continents away from one another. Over time, those drifting pieces move around the globe. On the opposite side of the world, older oceans may be closing, pulling the scattered continents back together. Eventually, another supercontinent forms, and the cycle begins again. This pattern affects more than just geography. It shapes climate, ocean circulation, and even the course of life. When continents cluster into a supercontinent, the interior regions tend to be dry and extreme, far from the moderating influence of the sea. When continents disperse, shallow seas spread along their margins, creating fertile environments for life. The breakup of Rodinia, for example, may have triggered global ice ages, while the assembly of Pangea reshaped ecosystems across the Permian period. Mountain building is also tied to the cycle. Every time continents collide, mountains rise. The Himalayas today are the result of India colliding with Asia, but collisions on a supercontinental scale produce ranges that stretch thousands of kilometers. Those mountains then erode, delivering nutrients into the oceans, fueling biological productivity. The sediment from erosion also buries organic carbon, affecting atmospheric composition. In this way, the supercontinent cycle links geology with biology and climate in a feedback system that shapes Earth's history. If you could watch Earth on fast forward, say over 1 billion years compressed into a few minutes, you'd see the continents drifting like slow dancers. They scatter, twirl, and then gather in a close embrace before scattering again. It's almost hypnotic, a rhythm that has no conductor except the physics of the planet itself. The evidence for this cycle comes from many sources. Paleomagnetism reveals the latitudes where rocks formed, allowing scientists to track the drift of continents through time. Matching mountain belts show where collisions occurred. Similar fossils and rock types across now distant continents indicate they were once joined. Radiometric dating provides the timeline anchoring the events in absolute age. When these pieces are combined, the story of repeated supercontinent formation becomes undeniable. And this story doesn't stop in the past. Even now, the continents are moving toward the next cycle. The Atlantic Ocean is widening as North America and Europe drift apart. The Pacific Ocean is shrinking as plates subduct along its margins. In 200 to 300 million years, it's likely that a new supercontinent will form, sometimes nicknamed Pangea Proxima. Whether it gathers in the place of the Pacific, closing it entirely, or in another configuration, closing the Atlantic instead, is still debated. But the cycle will continue as it always has. Thinking about the supercontinent cycle also helps us put human time in perspective. Civilizations rise and fall in a few thousand years. Species last a few million at most. Yet the continents move on timescales of hundreds of millions. When ancient people carved monuments, the continents were essentially where they are now. When dinosaurs roamed Pangea, the continents had only just gathered. When the first multicellular organisms appeared, Rodinia was breaking apart. Our entire history fits in a sliver of this immense rhythm. Some scientists wonder what role the cycle might play in Earth's long-term habitability. The recycling of crust through collisions and rifting helps regulate carbon dioxide levels, keeping the climate within ranges suitable for life. Without that recycling, greenhouse gases might accumulate unchecked, or the planet might freeze over permanently. In that sense, the cycle of supercontinents may be one reason Earth has remained habitable for billions of years, unlike Mars or Venus. There are also broader implications. Studying the cycle helps geologists predict where valuable mineral resources might be found. Many ore deposits formed during the collisions and breakups of supercontinents, concentrated by the intense tectonic processes at play. Understanding the timing and mechanics of the cycle is not just an academic exercise. It has practical benefits for modern society. But perhaps the most striking thing about the supercontinent cycle is its inevitability. Continents do not choose to come together or drift apart. They are compelled by the forces beneath them. The mantle convects, plates move, and the cycle continues. It is as much a part of Earth as its orbit around the sun or the rise and fall of tides. We live in one frame of that endless motion, but the dance has been going on for billions of years and will continue for billions more. When you look at a map of the world, it's easy to see only what is, but behind that map lies what was, and ahead of it lies what will be. The continents we know are temporary arrangements, chapters in a longer book. The supercontinent cycle is the book itself, the recurring pattern that ties the chapters together. And as we follow this rhythm across deep time, it naturally leads us to consider not just the continents themselves, but the oceans they shaped, the climates they produced, and the living worlds that rose and fell upon them. When we talk about continents moving and colliding, it's easy to focus on the land itself, the puzzle pieces that drift and rearrange. But for most of Earth's history, the true stage has been the oceans. Long before forests, long before animals walked on land, long before the familiar outlines of continents existed, the seas ruled everything. They were the cradle of life, the regulator of climate, the vast reservoir that covered nearly the entire planet. To understand Earth before Pangea, you have to imagine not just the wandering continents, but the oceans that spread between them, shaping every aspect of the planet's story. Today we live on a planet that is about 70% ocean, but in the deep past that percentage may have been even higher. The continents we know were smaller, scattered, sometimes clustered into supercontinents, sometimes broken into fragments, but always surrounded by water. Those oceans weren't static either. They opened and closed as continents drifted. One ancient sea would vanish as two landmasses collided, while somewhere else, a new ocean basin would appear as land rifted apart. The history of Earth is written in these vanished oceans, and though we can no longer sail them, their traces linger in the rocks beneath our feet. One of the most significant of these ancient oceans was called the Iapetus Ocean. It opened roughly 600 million years ago, between what would later become North America, Europe, and parts of South America. For more than 200 million years, the Iapetus stretched wide, hosting a rich array of early marine life. Trilobites scuttled along its seafloor, brachiopods filtered water through their shells, and the first primitive fish appeared in its shallows. Eventually, the Iapetus closed as continents drifted back together, giving way to Pangea. Today, the Appalachian Mountains in North America and the Caledonian Mountains in Europe mark the scars of that closure, long-eroded reminders of an ocean that no longer exists. But the Iapetus was far from the first. Before it, there were oceans with names like Merovia, Panthalassa, and Tethys, each associated with a different era of continental configuration. Merovia is thought to have surrounded the supercontinent Rodinia about 1 billion years ago, a global ocean stretching almost uninterrupted around the landmass. Panthalassa later dominated the world around Pangea, covering nearly 3/4 of the globe. The Tethys Ocean existed between Gondwana and Laurasia, before eventually closing to form parts of the Mediterranean region we know today. Each of these seas had its own lifespan, opening with rifts, thriving for millions of years, then vanishing as continents collided again. Imagine standing on the shore of one of those vanished oceans. The waves would look familiar, the sound would be the same, but everything else would be alien. The air might carry different gases, the sky a slightly different tint. The shoreline would be barren, no grass to soften it, no trees to provide shade, no animals leaving tracks in the sand. The life was in the water, not on the land. Shallow seas would have been carpeted with microbial mats, stromatolite reefs, and later, communities of shelled creatures. Deeper waters hosted strange forms that seem otherworldly to us now. Creatures with hard carapaces, frilled appendages, and body plans unlike anything alive today. The oceans also played a central role in regulating Earth's climate. Currents carried heat from the equator to the poles, distributing energy across the planet. When supercontinents formed, they disrupted those currents, changing patterns of heat and moisture. When supercontinents broke apart, new circulation systems developed. These shifts could trigger ice ages or greenhouse periods, creating environmental challenges that drove evolution forward. Chemistry, too, was controlled by the seas. As mountains eroded, minerals washed into the ocean, altering nutrient availability. Volcanic eruptions released gases that dissolved into seawater, affecting acidity. Oxygen levels in the oceans rose and fell, sometimes leading to mass die-offs of marine life when low-oxygen dead zones spread. The cycle of carbon between the atmosphere and ocean kept the planet habitable, a delicate balance maintained across billions of years. Many of the most important evolutionary steps happened in these oceans. Multicellular life first appeared there around 600 million years ago. The Cambrian explosion, a burst of evolutionary innovation around 540 million years ago, filled the seas with new forms of life, creatures with shells, spines and eyes. Fish, the ancestors of all vertebrates, arose in the oceans. Even the first steps onto land, when some fish evolved into amphibians, were only possible because the oceans had already nurtured complex forms. To call the oceans the rulers of early Earth is no exaggeration. They were the setting for nearly everything that mattered. It's easy to forget how many oceans have come and gone. We know the Atlantic, the Pacific, the Indian, but those are just the current cast. Before them came Panthalassa, Tethys, Iapetus, Reich, Merovia, and many more. Each existed for hundreds of millions of years, long enough for entire ecosystems to evolve and vanish. Their names may sound obscure, but their legacy is everywhere. The rocks beneath the Himalayas, the Andes and the Alps are filled with marine sediments deposited in oceans that no longer exist. Fossils of trilobites and brachiopods, once abundant in ancient seas, are now found on mountaintops, carried there by the collision of continents. The oceans were also dynamic in ways we rarely imagine today. Sea levels rose and fell dramatically, sometimes flooding large portions of continents to create shallow inland seas, other times retreating to expose wide coastal plains. During the Ordovician period, much of what is now North America was covered by shallow seas, home to coral reefs and early fish. Later, in the Cretaceous, high sea levels created inland seas that split North America in two. These transgressions and regressions, as geologists call them, shaped habitats and evolutionary pathways. Thinking about oceans before Pangea's rise forces us to reconsider what we think of as stable. The continents we stand on are fleeting. The seas we sail today are fleeting. Both are part of a constant cycle of creation and destruction. The oceans, perhaps even more than the continents, embody Earth's restlessness. They are born when continents rift. They thrive for eons, and they die when continents collide. And yet, despite their transience, they are also eternal. There has always been an ocean, even if not the same one. From the first pools that formed on a cooling Earth to the vast basins of today, water has been the consistent medium of life and change. It shifts shape, but it never disappears entirely. As we trace the oceans of the past, we see not just water, but time itself. Each vanished sea is a reminder that Earth has been many worlds, each with its own coastlines, currents and inhabitants. And from those seas came the life that eventually crawled onto land, looked up at the sky, and began to wonder about the world's beginnings. And so, from the rule of the seas, we drift naturally to the skies above them, to the strange atmospheres that blanketed Earth long before Pangea, when the air itself was as alien as the oceans were familiar. When we think about Earth's past, we often picture the land or the seas because they feel solid and familiar. But just as important to the story is the air above it all. The sky has not always been what it is today. The mix of gases we breathe, the blue we see, even the presence of clouds in the forms we recognize. These are the results of billions of years of change. If you were able to stand on Earth in different eras, the air around you would have felt and looked different, sometimes invisible but deadly, sometimes heavy with haze, sometimes thin and alien. The atmosphere has been a central player in the drama of Earth's history, shaping climate, guiding evolution, and even determining whether life could exist at all. The earliest atmosphere, more than 4 billion years ago, was nothing like what we know now. When Earth first cooled enough to hold gases, its sky would have been thick with hydrogen and helium, the lightest and most common elements in the universe. But those gases didn't stay long. Because Earth's gravity is relatively modest, they slowly leaked into space. What replaced them came from within. Volcanic eruptions released water vapour, carbon dioxide, nitrogen, methane, ammonia and other gases. This so-called secondary atmosphere was heavy, hazy, and hostile to anything resembling modern life. In that ancient sky, oxygen was almost non-existent. And because oxygen wasn't there to react with methane built up in the air. Methane is a potent greenhouse gas, trapping heat far more effectively than carbon dioxide. That may have been crucial, because the sun at the time was significantly dimmer than it is today. Without a strong greenhouse effect, Earth might have frozen solid. Instead, the methane-rich atmosphere kept the planet warm enough for liquid water to persist, and that water became the cradle of life. The first life, simple microbes, didn't need oxygen. Many were anaerobic, thriving in environments where oxygen would have been toxic. Some of them even produced methane themselves, reinforcing the greenhouse effect that kept Earth habitable under the faint young sun. It was a delicate balance, a planet maintained by the chemistry of its own atmosphere and the biology of the microbes within it. But then something happened that changed everything. Around 2.4 billion years ago, cyanobacteria evolved the ability to use sunlight to split water and carbon dioxide, producing oxygen as a byproduct. This was photosynthesis, and it was revolutionary. At first, the oxygen they released was absorbed by the oceans, where it reacted with dissolved iron to form rust. Those reactions created massive deposits of banded iron formations, alternating layers of red and black rock that we still see today. But eventually the sinks filled up. Oxygen began to spill into the atmosphere. This event, known as the Great Oxidation Event, transformed the sky. Oxygen levels rose, methane levels fell, and the greenhouse effect weakened. Earth cooled, perhaps triggering the first great ice ages, where glaciers spread even into the tropics. For the microbes that couldn't tolerate oxygen, it was a catastrophe. Many went extinct or retreated into oxygen-free niches. But for the future of life as we know it, it was the foundation. Oxygen made possible more complex metabolisms, more efficient ways of extracting energy. It set the stage for multicellular organisms, even if they wouldn't appear for another billion years. What would the sky have looked like in those times? Before oxygen, the haze of methane might have given it an orange or reddish tint, similar to what we see on Saturn's moon Titan today. Clouds may have been different too, forming from different chemical mixtures. After oxygen rose, the skies gradually cleared, becoming bluer, more like what we see now. The shift wasn't sudden, but over millions of years the atmosphere took on a new character, one that began to resemble the modern Earth. But oxygen levels didn't just rise steadily, they fluctuated. During some periods, oxygen may have reached near modern levels, only to drop again. The so-called boring billion, between 1.8 and 0.8 billion years ago, may have seen relatively low oxygen, enough for simple life but not enough for major evolutionary leaps. Only later, in the Ediacaran and Cambrian periods, did oxygen stabilise at higher levels, allowing complex animals to flourish. Volcanoes continued to play their part throughout all this, belching gases that could warm or cool the planet depending on the balance. Large igneous provinces, massive volcanic outpourings, released carbon dioxide in amounts that reshaped climate. Asteroid impacts could also inject dust and gases, briefly darkening the sky and altering conditions. The atmosphere was never static. It was a constantly shifting mix influenced by geology, biology, and space alike. And while oxygen is the star of the story for us, nitrogen has been the quiet constant. It makes up about 78% of the atmosphere today, and evidence suggests it has been a major component for billions of years. Nitrogen is inert, stable, and doesn't easily react away. Its steady presence gave Earth's atmosphere a bulk and a pressure that helped regulate temperature and kept water liquid. In a sense, nitrogen has been the invisible backdrop, while oxygen, carbon dioxide, and methane have been the actors delivering drama. Another factor in ancient skies was ultraviolet radiation. Before oxygen rose and before oxygen could form ozone, Earth had no protective ozone layer. Ultraviolet light from the sun streamed through unfiltered, bombarding the surface. Life survived mostly in the oceans, shielded by water or in shaded niches. Only after the ozone layer developed did life have the protection it needed to venture onto land. The sky itself, by gaining a thin layer of ozone high above, became a shield, changing the very possibilities for life's future. It's easy to take for granted that the sky we see is the way it has always been, a steady dome of blue by day and stars by night. But the truth is that the skies of ancient Earth would have been unrecognisable. A haze of methane, a pall of volcanic gases, a deep freeze under low greenhouse conditions, or a humid heat when carbon dioxide levels soared. The air has always been in flux, and life has always adapted to it, or shaped it in return. In fact, that's one of the most remarkable things about Earth's atmosphere. It's not just a passive feature, it's an interactive system. Life produces gases that alter the sky, and the sky in turn shapes what kinds of life can thrive. The Great Oxidation Event is the clearest example, but even later events show the same interplay. The rise of forests during the Devonian period, for example, drew down carbon dioxide and released oxygen, changing climate and paving the way for new animal groups. The sky and life are intertwined in a continuous feedback loop. To imagine walking under those strange skies is to imagine being an alien on your own planet. If you were dropped into the Archean atmosphere, you wouldn't survive a breath. If you stood on Canorland under the Great Oxidation, you might feel the bite of a global ice age. If you gazed up during the Cambrian, you'd see a sky that finally looked blue and familiar, but the world beneath it would still be alien in its creatures. The skies of the past remind us that Earth is not static. Even the air we breathe has a history. The next time you look up and see the colour of the sky, or watch clouds drift, you're seeing the product of billions of years of change, a sky sculpted by volcanoes, microbes, asteroids and forests alike. And from the air above, our story turns naturally back to the land below, where the first pioneers of life began to creep from ocean to shore, testing the strange and barren world that waited beyond the waves. For billions of years, the oceans were everything. They were the home of life, the regulator of climate, the world's great laboratory where biology slowly experimented with new forms. The continents, meanwhile, were barren. Waves broke on silent shores, winds blew over empty rock, and rivers carved valleys with no plants to hold their banks. The land was there, but it was lifeless, unclaimed. Then, little by little, life began to creep from the sea to the shore. It didn't happen with the splash of a fish suddenly walking on legs. That would come much later. The earlier steps were quieter, smaller, almost invisible. They began with microbes, mats of cells spreading across damp rocks, and later with the first moss-like plants, low and simple, braving the harsh conditions of a dry, unforgiving surface. To imagine those first pioneers, we need to remember how hostile the land would have seemed. In the oceans, life was buffered by water. Temperature changes were gradual, ultraviolet light was filtered, nutrients were carried in currents. On land, the conditions were harsh. Sunlight struck directly, drying out anything exposed. Without an ozone layer earlier in history, ultraviolet radiation was deadly. Even after the ozone formed, the lack of water made survival precarious. The air fluctuated between hot and cold, wet and dry. Rocks baked under the sun and chilled at night. Without soil, there was nothing to retain moisture, only bare mineral surfaces. And yet, microbes tried. We see their traces in stromatolite-like structures that extend onto ancient shorelines, in microfossils preserved in rocks more than 1 billion years old. They formed films and mats that clung to damp surfaces, trapping moisture and stabilizing themselves with secreted slime. These microbial mats were among the first ecosystems to colonize the edges of continents, bridging the gap between sea and land. In their tiny cells, they carried the same photosynthetic machinery that had already transformed Earth's atmosphere, now adapting it to a new and difficult environment. Eventually, something more complex followed. Somewhere around 470 million years ago, small plants related to modern mosses and liverworts began to appear. They were still primitive, lacking true roots or leaves, but they could anchor themselves to rock and soil. Their tissues were thin and fragile, but they had adaptations that allowed them to resist drying out. Waxy coatings is spore-based reproduction, the ability to absorb water directly from their surroundings. They hugged the ground, low mats and tufts spreading across damp surfaces. The arrival of these moss-like pioneers was a turning point. For the first time, the land was not completely barren. Patches of green began to appear along rivers, lakes, and coastlines. Tiny though they were, they began to change the landscape. Their presence slowed erosion, trapping sediments and creating the first primitive soils. Their photosynthesis drew carbon dioxide from the air and released oxygen, further altering the atmosphere. They created habitats for microbes and fungi, forming partnerships that made survival easier. Fungi in particular may have played a key role. Fossils show that fungi were already well adapted to land, sending out thread-like hyphae to extract nutrients from rock. Some scientists think plants and fungi formed early symbiotic relationships, with fungi helping plants obtain minerals while plants provided carbohydrates in return. This partnership may have been crucial for those early moss-like plants, giving them the extra support needed to survive in a difficult world. The impact of these first land plants was enormous, even though they were small. As they spread, they increased the rate of chemical weathering of the rocks, pulling carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. That cooling influence may have contributed to ice ages during the Ordovician period. Their build-up of organic matter enriched soils, paving the way for larger plants to come. Their stabilizing effect on landscapes allowed rivers to form more complex channels, changing the way water flowed across continents. All of this came from organisms no taller than a few centimeters. What would the world have looked like then? Picture a rocky coastline under a strange ancient sky, with tides washing over microbial mats, leaving them glistening in the sun. Farther inland, damp hollows hold patches of moss-like plants, green against the grey of stone. There are no forests, no grasses, no flowers. The tallest plants are only ankle high. The air is filled not with the scent of blossoms, but with the mineral tang of wet rock. Silence dominates, broken only by the wind and the lap of waves. Yet in that silence, life is taking its first steps onto land. Animals followed later, but at first, the only creatures sharing the land with these early plants were invertebrates like millipede-like arthropods and primitive insects. Even those came after the plants had already started the process of colonization. In this sense, plants were the true pioneers, reshaping the land so that animals could eventually follow. There's something humbling about how small they were, and yet how transformative. We often imagine revolutions in life's history as dramatic events, dinosaurs dominating the world, mammals rising after their extinction. But the first colonization of land was quiet, carried out by mats of moss and films of microbes. They worked slowly, cell by cell, but their impact was planetary. Scientists studying this transition look at spores preserved in rocks, some dating back nearly 500 million years. These spores show features similar to modern mosses, suggesting that land plants were already diversifying by then. They also study isotopic signatures in soils, which show chemical changes consistent with plant activity. The evidence builds a picture of a gradual but steady colonization, starting at the edges and pushing farther inland. The spread of life onto land also changed erosion patterns. With plants anchoring soil, rivers could carve more stable channels, leading to new types of landscapes. Deltas, floodplains, and meandering rivers all became more common as plants stabilized the ground. These changes, in turn, created new habitats, feedback loops where plants shaped the land and the land shaped the plants. Over time, those simple moss-like pioneers gave way to more complex plants, ferns, lycophytes, horsetails. They grew taller, developed vascular systems to transport water, and eventually built the first forests, but it all began with the tiny green tufts that dared to leave the sea behind, and the consequences of that step are still with us. Every forest, every meadow, every patch of grass owes its existence to those first colonizers. They were the bridge between ocean and land, the experiment that succeeded against all odds. The shoreline is where it all began, and from there the story spread inland until the continents were no longer barren but alive. And as plants built their green empires, the oceans themselves were undergoing their own revolutions, filling with creatures stranger and more complex than anything that had existed before. Long before forests covered the land or dinosaurs thundered across Pangea, the oceans were already full of life, not the kind of life we know today, with familiar fish darting through coral reefs or whales cruising the deep, but stranger older forms, creatures that seem alien to us now, with body plans that never survived into the present, ruled the seas of ancient Earth. When we think of early life, it's easy to picture microbes and then skip ahead to fish, but between those two stages was a whole world of extraordinary animals that lived, thrived, and disappeared in oceans that no longer exist. The Cambrian period, starting about 541 million years ago, is where this story often begins. In a geological blink of time, life diversified at a pace never seen before, an event we call the Cambrian explosion. Within a few tens of millions of years, the seas went from being populated mostly by soft-bodied, simple organisms to hosting creatures with shells, spines, eyes, and complex body structures. Trilobites, with their armoured segments and compound eyes, crawled along seafloors in astonishing numbers. Some were the size of a fingernail, others reached lengths of 0.5 metre or more, making them the dominant animals of their time. But trilobites were just one part of the Cambrian seas. There were also creatures like Anomalocaris, a predator that looked like nothing alive today. It had large grasping appendages at the front, a circular mouth lined with plates, and a body built for swimming. Some reached lengths of nearly 2 metres, making them among the largest predators of their age. Imagine drifting in the warm, shallow seas of the Cambrian and seeing this alien hunter glide past, its body rippling as it chased trilobites across the seafloor. Other forms were equally strange. Rodinia had 5 eyes and a long flexible proboscis tipped with a claw, which it used to probe the seafloor for food. Hallucigenia walked on spindly legs, with spines jutting from its back like a nightmare porcupine. Wiwaxia was covered in scales and long spines, like a living pincushion. These creatures, preserved in places like the Burgess Shale of Canada, reveal a world of experimentation, where evolution was trying out forms that sometimes flourished and sometimes vanished without descendants. By the Ordovician period, a few million years later, life had expanded even further. Reefs grew, built not by corals at first, but by different groups of organisms, including sponges and algae. Brachiopods, shelled animals that resembled clams but were unrelated, spread across the seafloor. Crinoids, also known as sea lilies, waved their feathery arms from stalks anchored to the bottom, filtering food from the water. Cephalopods, ancestors of modern squid and octopus, began to appear, some with long, straight shells that could reach several meters in length. These early cephalopods became some of the top predators of their time, cruising through oceans that were otherwise dominated by filter feeders and small arthropods. Imagine a giant torpedo-shaped shell drifting through the water, tentacles emerging from one end to snatch prey. It was a far cry from the sleek squids and octopuses we know today, but it set the stage for their future success. As time went on, new groups appeared. By the Silurian and Devonian periods, the first jawed fish had evolved. Armoured placoderms swam the seas, covered in heavy plates. Dunkleosteus, one of the largest of them, grew to lengths of nearly 10 metres and had jaws strong enough to crush through bone and shell. It was a terror of the Devonian seas, hunting other fish and asserting itself as one of the planet's first true super predators. Alongside the placoderms were early sharks, smaller but already efficient hunters, and bony fish, which would eventually give rise to most modern fish lineages. The Devonian is sometimes called the Age of Fishes because of the diversity that appeared then. Reefs grew more complex, built now by corals, and the seas became busier, noisier, more competitive. But throughout all of this, strange and unfamiliar creatures still thrived. Eurypterids, sometimes called sea scorpions, prowled shallow waters. Some were small, but others reached lengths of 2.5 meters, their clawed limbs snapping shut on prey. Trilobites continued to dominate, though they began to decline later on. Ammonites, coiled, shelled relatives of squids and octopuses, spread widely, leaving behind fossils that are now among the most common and beautiful of ancient shells. The oceans were also home to experiments that didn't last. Many of the bizarre body plans of the Cambrian eventually disappeared, replaced by more stable designs that survived into modern times. But that experimentation was essential. It was in those oceans that eyes first evolved, that hard shells became common, that predation and defense escalated into arms races. The diversity of forms created in those early seas set the foundation for everything that followed. When we think of vanished seas like the Iapetus or the Rheic, we often picture only the shifting continents that defined them. But within those waters lived entire ecosystems now lost to time. Reefs taller than buildings, forests of crinoids swaying in currents, shoals of trilobites scuttling in synchrony, giant predators gliding through the depths. It was a living world as rich and dramatic as anything today, just unfamiliar to our eyes. And the seas were not always stable havens. Mass extinction struck repeatedly, wiping out large portions of marine life. The Ordovician-Silurian extinction, about 440 million years ago, killed off many trilobites and brachiopods. The Devonian extinction, around 375 million years ago, devastated reef systems and placoderm fish. Each extinction reshaped the oceans, clearing space for new groups to rise. It was a cycle of flourishing and collapse, driven by shifts in climate, sea levels, and atmospheric chemistry, all linked to the restless motion of continents and the supercontinent cycle. What fascinates scientists is how much of this history is preserved in fossils. The Burgess Shale in Canada, the Chengjiang Formation in China, and other sites have given us windows into these ancient worlds, capturing even soft-bodied creatures that would normally leave no trace. They show us not only what lived, but how diverse and strange early life was. The fossil record is incomplete, but what survives is enough to give us a sense of oceans teeming with forms unlike anything alive now. If you could dive into those ancient seas, you might feel like you were visiting another planet. Instead of schools of fish, you'd see trilobites crawling and swimming. Instead of dolphins or whales, you'd see cephalopods with straight shells cruising slowly by. Instead of corals building reefs, you'd see layers of sponges and algae. Predators would look alien, prey would look strange, and yet the basic dynamics, hunting, hiding, feeding, reproducing, would be familiar. Life was experimenting with the same challenges it faces today, just with different tools. And from those oceans the path to land began. Some fish developed lungs and limbs, venturing into shallow waters and eventually onto damp shores. Amphibians followed, then reptiles, then mammals, then us. But the oceans were always the first stage, the testing ground where evolution's boldest experiments played out. So when we speak of ancient oceans inhabitants, we're speaking of worlds as real as ours, worlds full of colour and sound and movement, even if their players seem alien to us now. They were the pioneers that filled the seas before forests filled the land, the strange precursors that set the stage for the animals we know. And just as oceans nurtured life, they also reflected Earth's climate. Warm periods, ice ages, greenhouse spikes, all of these were written in the chemistry of seawater and the creatures that lived there. Which brings us naturally to how climate itself looked in those times before Pangea, when the planet cycled between frozen worlds and fiery greenhouses, shaping both oceans and land alike. When we picture Earth's climate, it's tempting to imagine something stable. We think of the seasons as regular, the general patterns as predictable, the sky as familiar. But Earth's climate has never been fixed. It has shifted dramatically, swinging between extremes that make our present seem mild. Before Pangea gathered the continents together, the planet passed through ages of deep freeze, times when ice may have stretched nearly to the equator, as well as greenhouse worlds where tropical conditions reached into the high latitudes and summers burned far hotter than we know today. To understand climate before Pangea, you have to imagine a world where the continents were scattered, sometimes gathered into earlier supercontinents like Rodinia or Nuna, sometimes drifting apart. Their positions determined how oceans circulated, and ocean circulation is one of the great engines of climate. When continents clustered near the equator, warm currents moved differently than when land blocked them at higher latitudes. Mountain building, volcanic eruptions, and the chemistry of the atmosphere all combined to make Earth's climate a restless, shifting system. One of the most striking episodes came after Rodinia began to break apart, around 720 to 635 million years ago. This was the time of the so-called snowball Earth events. Evidence suggests that glaciers advanced to sea level near the equator, ice covering much of the planet's surface. Imagine looking at Earth from space then, a white marble gleaming with ice from pole to pole. It's hard to imagine oceans locked beneath kilometres of frozen cover, continents buried, and only small pockets of liquid water surviving. Yet somehow, life endured. Microbial communities clung to refuges near volcanic vents, or under thin ice where light could still penetrate. What caused these global freezes? One likely factor was the breakup of Rodinia itself. As new continents spread across the equator, weathering rates changed, drawing down carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. With less greenhouse gas to trap heat, the planet cooled. Ice advanced, and because ice reflects sunlight, the cooling fed on itself. Once started, the glaciations may have been difficult to stop. The eventual release came from volcanoes, which continued emitting carbon dioxide even while the planet was frozen. Over millions of years, those gases built up until they triggered a rapid greenhouse effect, melting the ice and plunging Earth into the opposite extreme, a hothouse world. These swings show just how sensitive climate has been to the arrangement of land and sea. Supercontinents, by clustering land together, tend to promote extremes. Their interiors are dry and seasonal, while their breakups open shallow seas that moderate temperatures. When Nuna existed around 1.5 billion years ago, evidence suggests the climate may have been relatively stable but still warmer than today. When Kenneland formed earlier, Earth may have experienced the first major glaciations tied to the rise of oxygen in the atmosphere. Each supercontinent cycle brought with it new climate rhythms, and the atmosphere itself played an enormous role. For much of Earth's history, carbon dioxide levels were far higher than today, sometimes 10 to 20 times modern concentrations. These greenhouse levels kept the planet warm despite a fainter sun, but they also fluctuated with tectonic activity. When volcanoes were especially active, they poured carbon dioxide into the air, heating the planet. When mountain ranges rose and began to weather, they pulled carbon dioxide down, cooling the planet. It was a feedback system in constant motion, with no permanent equilibrium. Greenhouse periods could be astonishingly hot. During the Cambrian and Ordovician, warm seas reached into polar regions. During the Devonian, vast forests drew down carbon dioxide, cooling the climate, but earlier in that same period, tropical conditions extended nearly worldwide. Later, in the Carboniferous, oxygen levels soared as plants spread, while carbon dioxide fell, leading to cooler global conditions and widespread glaciation in Gondwana. These shifts shaped life profoundly. During Snowball Earth, survival pushed life to its limits, but when the ice retreated, ecosystems exploded with diversity. The Cambrian explosion followed not long after, filling the seas with new forms of animals. Greenhouse worlds provided warm, shallow seas rich in nutrients, perfect for reef building and diversification. Ice ages, by contrast, pruned ecosystems, driving extinctions but also forcing innovation. Climate extremes also influenced the chemistry of the oceans. During greenhouse phases, oceans often became stratified, with warm water sitting on top of oxygen-poor deeper layers. This led to anoxic events, where large portions of the seafloor lacked oxygen, devastating marine life. During ice ages, cold, oxygen-rich waters spread, supporting different kinds of ecosystems. The balance between these states determined what kinds of life could thrive. If you could stand on ancient Earth during one of these extremes, the difference would be dramatic. In a Snowball episode, the shoreline would be encased in ice, seas frozen solid, winds sharp and dry. The air would be thin of carbon dioxide and the land would echo with silence. In a greenhouse world, the heat would be heavy, tropical storms fierce, coastlines flooded as sea levels rose. Forests or microbial mats would crowd damp ground, and the air would carry the weight of high humidity. Both states were part of Earth's natural rhythm, oscillating across millions of years. The fiery summers of greenhouse worlds could last millions of years, shaping entire ecosystems. Plants and animals that could tolerate heat thrived, while others perished. During the Devonian, for example, widespread warmth supported massive reefs, but later fluctuations led to one of the great mass extinctions of the seas. Extremes of climate were never just background conditions, they were active agents, reshaping the course of evolution. And yet, through all these changes, life endured. From microbes under ice to fish in hot shallow seas, organisms adapted, diversified, and sometimes reinvented themselves entirely. Climate without Pangea was unpredictable, unstable, sometimes harsh, sometimes generous, but always transformative. Thinking about this history makes our present seem different. We live in a comparatively stable climate, with continents scattered in a way that moderates extremes. But the record of ancient Earth shows us how fragile that balance can be. Land and sea arrangements, volcanic pulses, atmospheric chemistry, all can tip the balance toward ice or fire. And as the climate shifted, so too did the forces beneath the surface. Volcanoes and earthquakes played their parts, not only reshaping land, but constantly injecting new variables into the climate system, reminding us that Earth is as restless below as it is above. If there is one constant in Earth's history, it is that the planet never stops breathing fire. Continents shift slowly, oceans spread and close over millions of years, but volcanoes are the reminders that beneath all of it lies a restless interior. Long before Pangea formed, before even Rodinia or Nuna, Earth's surface was being shaped and reshaped by eruptions, lava flows and the gases they released. Fire has always been one of the planet's languages, sometimes destructive, sometimes creative, but always central to the story of land, sea and life. When we think of volcanoes today, we might imagine a single cone like Mount Fuji, Etna, or Kilimanjaro, a solitary mountain standing above the landscape. But in the deep past, especially before Pangea, volcanic activity often occurred on a much larger scale. There were flood basalts, massive outpourings of lava that covered areas the size of continents. There were volcanic arcs along subduction zones, chains of mountains belching ash and gas into the sky. There were rifts where continents began to split, releasing magma that hardened into new crust. These processes were constant, pulsing in rhythm with the motion of plates and the cycles of supercontinents. Volcanoes were not just scenery, they were engines of climate and geology. Every eruption released gases into the atmosphere. Carbon dioxide, sulfur dioxide, water vapour. Carbon dioxide warmed the planet, Sulfur dioxide cooled it by reflecting sunlight, water vapour fueled storms. Depending on the balance, volcanoes could tip Earth toward hothouse conditions or ice ages. In the long stretches of time before Pangea, their influence was immense. Take, for example, the great volcanic outpourings that marked the breakup of supercontinents. When Rodinia began to rift apart around 750 million years ago, vast volcanic provinces erupted, leaving behind thick layers of basalt. Those eruptions not only created new crust, but also altered climate by injecting greenhouse gases into the air. Some scientists think the interplay between rifting, volcanism, and atmospheric chemistry played a role in triggering the snowball Earth glaciations. Later, during the Devonian and Carboniferous periods, other large volcanic events reshaped ecosystems and climates. When continents collided, subduction zones fueled fiery arcs of volcanoes. When continents rifted, flood basalts poured out. The pattern is clear. Every major step in the supercontinent cycle was accompanied by volcanic fire. The fire was also a builder. Volcanic eruptions created new land, forming islands and expanding continents. Much of the early continental crust was forged in volcanic arcs, where magma rising from subducting plates crystallized into granite. The continents we know today are mosaics of volcanic origins, stitched together by mountain belts and arcs that once thundered with eruptions. Without volcanoes, there would be no stable continents at all, only thin oceanic crust constantly recycled into the mantle. Life, too, was shaped by volcanic fire. Eruptions could devastate ecosystems, smothering seas with ash, or poisoning the air with gases. Mass extinctions were sometimes linked to volcanic events, when prolonged eruptions released so much carbon dioxide that climates shifted catastrophically. One of the greatest examples, though later than our pre-Pangea focus, was the Siberian Traps eruption around 252 million years ago, which coincided with the end Permian extinction. But even earlier, before Pangea, similar large igneous provinces had dramatic effects, clearing the way for new evolutionary opportunities. And yet, volcanoes also nurtured life. Hydrothermal systems associated with volcanism may have provided the chemical energy for some of the earliest microbial communities. Hot springs, volcanic islands, and mid-ocean ridges created niches where life could thrive, experimenting with new metabolisms. Even in times when the atmosphere was hostile, these volcanic environments offered sheltered pockets. In this sense, fire was not just destructive but also a cradle, offering opportunities for survival and innovation. To imagine the Earth before Pangea is to imagine landscapes dominated by fire. Along coastlines, chains of volcanic islands smoked against the horizon. In the interiors of supercontinents, rift zones cracked open, spilling lava across hundreds of kilometers. Flood basalts cooled into dark plains, later eroded into plateaus. Skies sometimes turned red with ash, and the smell of sulfur drifted across seas. It was not a gentle world, but it was a fertile one, constantly recycling itself, constantly preparing the stage for whatever came next. The gases released by volcanoes left long-lasting marks. Carbon dioxide warmed the planet, sometimes tipping it into greenhouse phases. Sulfur dioxide, though shorter-lived, could plunge climates into sudden chills by blocking sunlight. These short-term and long-term effects shaped evolutionary pressures. Species had to adapt not only to landscapes but also to climates that could swing rapidly because of volcanic activity. Scientists trace these events through ancient rocks. Layers of basalt mark past eruptions. Ash beds preserve microscopic crystals that can be dated precisely, anchoring the timeline of events. Isotopic signatures in marine sediments reveal shifts in carbon dioxide levels tied to volcanic pulses. All of these clues tell us that fire has been an inseparable companion to continental drift and the supercontinent cycle. Volcanoes also remind us that Earth is not inert. The planet is alive in its own way, heat moving outward from its core, driving convection in the mantle, fueling eruptions at the surface. Long before humans walked the land, long before dinosaurs, even long before animals with skeletons existed, this process was at work, endlessly reshaping the surface. The restless breath of fire has never stopped, and it never will. At least not for billions of years, until the planet cools more completely. If you could stand on Earth during the age of Rodinia, Nuna or Kenorland, the sights would have been astonishing. Rivers of lava stretching to the horizon, fountains of molten rock lighting up the night sky, volcanic mountains taller than Everest spewing ash into a strange alien atmosphere. And yet, alongside the violence were the quiet processes of creation. New crust hardening, new minerals forming, new land rising from the sea. And just as volcanoes shape the continents, they also shape the oceans. Undersea eruptions built mid-ocean ridges where new crust spread and vents spewed superheated water. Those vents, rich in minerals, became oases for microbial life. Even in today's oceans, such hydrothermal vent communities thrive, sustained not by sunlight, but by chemical energy. It is not hard to imagine that similar communities existed in the deep past long before animals, making volcanism a central factor in life's persistence. The rhythm of fire and land continued through every stage of Earth's pre-Pangea story. Each time a supercontinent assembled, volcanic arcs flared along its margins. Each time a supercontinent broke apart, rifting released floods of lava. Fire was both bookend and bridge, marking the beginnings and ends of each continental cycle. And as continents burned and reformed, the ground beneath them never stopped shifting. Volcanoes were only one expression of that restlessness. Earthquakes, too, were constant companions of drifting plates, shaking ancient landscapes as the crust adjusted and released its stored energy. When we think of earthquakes today, we usually imagine them in specific places: Japan, California, Turkey, Chile. These are regions that make the news because they sit along active plate boundaries. Fault lines mark their landscapes, and seismic waves occasionally remind us that Earth's crust is not as solid as it feels beneath our feet. But the truth is that earthquakes have always been everywhere. They are not limited to the present map of danger zones. In Earth's long past, before Pangea, before even Rodinia or Nuna, earthquakes were a constant companion to the drifting plates, rattling a world that looked nothing like the one we know. To understand why, it helps to remember what earthquakes really are. They are the release of stress built up in the crust as tectonic plates move. Plates collide, slide past each other, or pull apart, and the crust bends, stretches, and locks. Eventually, the stress becomes too much, and it snaps, sending waves rippling outward. That snap might last only seconds, but its effects can reshape landscapes, trigger landslides, or raise tsunamis. And because plate tectonics has been active for billions of years, earthquakes have been part of Earth's story from the very beginning. Before Pangea, the positions of continents were different, but the same principles applied. When supercontinents like Rodinia assembled, their margins were zones of intense seismicity. Subduction zones drag one plate beneath another, producing chains of earthquakes that sometimes stretched for thousands of kilometers. When those supercontinents broke apart, rifts split their interiors, and earthquakes marked every stage of that tearing. No part of Earth was immune. The difference is that the outlines of the continents were unfamiliar, the oceans had different names, and the fault lines have long since shifted or vanished. The evidence of those ancient quakes is still visible in rocks. Fault zones cut through ancient cratons, marking where stress once fractured the crust. Metamorphic rocks show signs of sudden high pressures, frozen snapshots of seismic jolts. In some places, fossilized landslides preserve the traces of ancient shaking. Though we can't measure the magnitudes of quakes from hundreds of millions of years ago, the scars they left behind tell us they were as powerful as anything today, and sometimes more so. Imagine standing on the shore of the Iapetus Ocean as it was opening. Rifts crack the crust, and earthquakes shook the land as magma welled up from below. Or picture yourself on Rodinia, in its interior deserts, as stress built up along rift zones that would eventually split the supercontinent apart. The ground would tremble unpredictably, fault lines would open, rivers would shift their courses. For early life, which was still mostly confined to the seas, these events might have passed unnoticed. But the planet was restless, its crust never truly quiet. Earthquakes were also tied to mountain building. When continents collided, the crust crumpled, and seismic shocks rippled through the ranges. The formation of the Rodinia, a mountain belt tied to Rodinia's assembly, would have been accompanied by countless earthquakes as slabs of crust jammed together. Later, as those mountains eroded, the faults remained, sometimes reactivating in new cycles of stress. Even today, some of the earthquakes in so-called stable continental interiors are echoes of those ancient scars, fault lines that never fully healed. It's easy to imagine that earthquakes are purely destructive, but they also played a role in shaping the environment. By fracturing rock, they created new pathways for fluids, allowing minerals to deposit in veins. Many of the deposits we mine today were concentrated by these processes, born in the aftermath of seismic activity. Earthquakes also shifted rivers, dammed valleys, and created new basins, altering landscapes in ways that influenced ecosystems. If you had lived in those times, not as a human of course, but perhaps imagining yourself as some observer, you wouldn't have recognized the map. Continents were arranged differently, shorelines curved in alien ways, oceans stretched where none exist today. But the sound of the earth shaking, the feeling of the ground lurching beneath you, would have been familiar. It is one of the few constants in Earth's story. Scientists study ancient earthquakes not only through faults, but also through seismites, sedimentary layers disturbed by shaking. These soft sediment deformations capture the violence of a tremor in the patterns they leave behind. Slumps, convolutions and cracks that froze in place as the sediments hardened into rock. Some of these seismites date back more than 1 billion years, direct evidence that earthquakes were shaking ancient seas long before Pangea. There's also the question of scale. Were ancient earthquakes bigger than modern ones? In some cases they may have been. When supercontinents collided, the stresses involved were immense, and the faults extended for thousands of kilometres. A single rupture could have released energy on a scale beyond anything we've measured in recent centuries. The magnitude 9 quakes we know today may have been matched or even exceeded by events in Earth's deep past. Of course, the creatures alive at those times didn't know the word earthquake. Trilobites scuttling along the Ordovician seafloor, early fish in Devonian rivers, microbial mats clinging to shoreline rocks, all would have felt the effects, though not as we do. A sudden collapse of a reef, a pulse of sediment stirred into the water, a shoreline reshaped overnight. For them, earthquakes were just part of the environment, no different from storms or tides. Thinking about earthquakes before Pangea reminds us that the planet's dynamism isn't new. We sometimes imagine early Earth as static until life or continents made it interesting. But the truth is the crust has always been in motion, always releasing its stress in sudden bursts. What changes is only the map on which it happens. Today we map faults, measure tremors, and build structures to withstand them. In the past there was no such preparation, only the raw interaction between rock and stress. Yet those ancient quakes shaped the world we inherited, carving basins, forming mountains, and even guiding the distribution of resources. And just as earthquakes were constant companions to early continents, so too were the forests that would later rise, transforming the land and atmosphere in ways just as profound as any seismic shift. Before Pangea, before dinosaurs, before even the first reptiles had appeared, something quietly world-changing happened on land. Plants, which had once clung to the edges of lakes and coastlines as tiny moss-like patches, began to grow taller, sturdier, and more complex. In time, they formed forests, dense green expanses that stretched across continents, covering valleys, climbing hills, and creating shadows where none had existed before. To us, a forest feels natural, almost eternal, but in Earth's history it was a radical invention. The first forests did not just alter landscapes, they remade the atmosphere, changed the chemistry of the oceans, influenced climate, and set the stage for whole new forms of life. The earliest plants on land, as we've seen, were small and simple. They had no roots, no leaves, no wood. They were fragile and low to the ground, limited to damp places where they could absorb water directly. But evolution is persistent. By the Silurian period, around 430 million years ago, some plants had developed vascular systems, networks of tubes that allowed them to move water and nutrients within their bodies. This innovation freed them from the constant need to stay wet. They could grow taller, survive in drier soils, and spread farther inland. The first vascular plants were still small by our standards, maybe a few centimetres to a metre tall. Cooksonia is a classic example, a simple branching plant with spore-bearing capsules at its tips. But from these humble beginnings, lineages quickly diversified. By the Devonian period, around 390 million years ago, true trees had appeared. Archaeopteris is often considered the first real tree. It had woody trunks, branches and leaves, and it could reach heights of up to 30 metres. Imagine walking across a landscape that had been barren rock and moss for billions of years, and suddenly finding yourself among towering trunks casting shade. It must have been an astonishing transformation. Forests spread rapidly once they evolved. Lycophytes, ferns, horsetails, and early seed plants grew in dense stands. Their roots stabilised soils, preventing erosion. Their leaves intercepted rainfall, slowing the movement of water across the land. Their trunks and branches created new habitats for insects and other organisms. And through photosynthesis, they drew carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, pumping oxygen back in. The effect on Earth's climate was profound. During the Devonian and Carboniferous periods, forests pulled so much carbon dioxide out of the air that global temperatures dropped. Massive ice sheets formed in the southern hemisphere, while oxygen levels rose higher than at almost any other time in history. Estimates suggest oxygen may have made up more than 30% of the atmosphere, compared to 21% today, that enriched air fueled giant arthropods, millipedes the size of cars, dragonflies with wingspans of nearly a metre, scorpions that dwarfed their modern relatives. They thrived because higher oxygen allowed their inefficient respiratory systems to support larger bodies. Forests also changed the soil itself. Before plants with roots, soils were thin, mostly weathered rock with little organic content. The spread of forests created thick, rich soils filled with decaying leaves, roots, and wood. Those soils held water and nutrients, reshaping the hydrology of the land. Rivers became more stable, meandering and branching in ways they never had before. Wetlands expanded, forming new ecosystems. The land itself became more dynamic, more varied, more alive. The impact extended to the oceans as well. Nutrients washed from forested lands into rivers and then to seas, fueling blooms of marine life. But the burial of organic carbon in forest soils and swamps also reduced carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, triggering global cooling. This interplay between forests, atmosphere, and oceans was one of the most significant environmental shifts in Earth's history. The Carboniferous period, around 359 to 299 million years ago, is named for the coal deposits formed then, and those coals are the direct legacy of the first forests. Vast swampy forests stretched across equatorial regions, filled with lycophyte trees like Lepidodendron and Sigillaria, their scaly trunks rising 30 metres into the air. When these forests died, their remains piled up in waterlogged soils where decay was slow. Over millions of years, heat and pressure transformed those remains into coal. The energy we still burn today is, in many cases, sunlight captured by the first forests hundreds of millions of years ago. Walking through one of those ancient forests would have been surreal. The trees were not like our familiar oaks and pines. Many had strange, spiny trunks, crown-like clusters of leaves, or giant spores instead of seeds. The ground was wet and marshy, buzzing with insects far larger than any alive now. Amphibians, some as large as crocodiles, lurked in the swamps. It was a world halfway between the seas that had dominated before and the terrestrial ecosystems we know today. And the forests did not just change biology, they changed geology. By locking carbon away in coal and organic sediments, they altered the balance of gases in the atmosphere. This cooling influence may have helped trigger ice ages during the late Carboniferous and early Permian. The cycle of forests spreading, carbon being buried, and climate shifting was one of the great feedback systems of the pre-Pangea world. The rise of forests also spurred evolutionary innovation. Insects diversified to take advantage of new food sources. Some developed the ability to fly, buzzing between plants and feeding on spores or sap. Amphibians found shelter in forest pools, while early reptiles began laying eggs with protective shells, freeing them from the need to return to water to reproduce. Forests created niches, and life filled them with astonishing speed. In many ways, the first forests were the Earth's first great experiment in complexity on land. They layered ecosystems vertically, creating canopies, understories, and forest floors. They transformed the cycling of water and nutrients. They connected the atmosphere, lithosphere, and biosphere in new ways. And once they appeared, there was no turning back. Forests became a permanent feature of the planet, evolving into new forms but never vanishing completely. Scientists trace this story through fossils of wood, leaves, and spores, as well as through coal seams and isotopic records. The evidence shows that the transition was gradual but revolutionary. In just a few tens of millions of years, the face of the continents went from barren to lush, from silence to the hum of insects and the croaks of amphibians. It's difficult to overstate how profound the impact of forests was. They didn't just decorate the land with greenery, they redefined the relationship between land, air, and life. In many ways, they made the modern Earth possible. The oxygen we breathe, the soils we grow crops in, the climate systems we depend on, all trace their roots back to those first forests. And as forests spread, they supported creatures that grew larger and stranger than ever before. Arthropods, in particular, thrived in the high oxygen world they created, growing into giants that crawled, scuttled, and flew through the shadows of those primeval trees. As forests spread across the continents long before Pangea fully formed, they created not only green landscapes but entirely new opportunities for life. The air was richer in oxygen than at almost any other time in Earth's history. The ground was soft with soils and swamps, and the shadows of towering trees provided shelter. Into this world came creatures that tested what it meant to live on land. Some crept from the seas in hesitant steps, while others adapted fully to life among roots and leaves. The results were both strange and spectacular. Giant arthropods that dwarfed their modern relatives, amphibians exploring the muddy edges of forests, and the first reptiles laying eggs that freed them from water. Arthropods were among the earliest and most successful pioneers. They had already thrived in the oceans for hundreds of millions of years, and their hard exoskeletons gave them protection and support as they ventured onto land. Millipede-like forms appeared first, scuttling across damp ground and feeding on decaying plant matter. Soon after came scorpions, centipedes, and primitive insects. But in the Carboniferous period, roughly 350 to 300 million years ago, these arthropods reached astonishing sizes. Imagine a millipede stretching over 2 meters long, as wide as a small dog. This was Arthropleura, one of the largest invertebrates to ever walk the earth. It lived in the swampy forests feeding on decaying plants, and it likely had few predators large enough to challenge it. Its sheer size was possible because of the high oxygen content in the atmosphere at the time, estimated at over 30% compared to today's 21%. Arthropods breathe through networks of tubes called tracheae, which rely on diffusion to bring oxygen into their bodies. The higher the oxygen in the air, the larger their bodies could grow without suffocating. Flying insects also took advantage of this oxygen-rich world. Dragonflies with wingspans of nearly a metre soared over forests and swamps. Their enormous size would be impossible today, but in the Carboniferous skies they were masters of flight and among the top aerial predators. Their compound eyes, already highly developed, gave them an advantage in spotting prey, while their powerful wings allowed them to patrol wide territories. Scorpions and spiders too grew larger than modern versions, inhabiting the dark understories of forests. Imagine walking through a primeval forest, ankle-deep in ferns, only to see a scorpion the length of your forearm scuttling across the ground. The abundance of oxygen and the abundance of food created by plant life allowed arthropods to flourish in ways that seem almost fantastical now. But arthropods were not alone. Amphibians emerged from the waters to take advantage of the new land environments. They descended from lobe-finned fish, creatures that had evolved sturdy fins and primitive lungs. Tiktaalik, a famous transitional fossil from about 375 million years ago, shows features of both fish and amphibians, fins with bones resembling wrists, lungs alongside gills, a flat head suited for peaking above water. From these transitional species came the first true amphibians. By the Carboniferous, amphibians were diverse and often enormous. Some resembled giant salamanders, others crocodile-like hunters lurking in swamps. They laid their eggs in water, which limited them to moist environments, but within those wetlands they were top predators. Their diets included fish, insects, and smaller amphibians. Their success was tied closely to the forests and swamps that spread across the continents, giving them both shelter and prey. Still, amphibians faced limits. They were tied to water for reproduction, and their skin required moisture. To go farther onto land, a new innovation was needed, and it came with the reptiles. Sometime around 310 million years ago, certain amphibian-like animals developed eggs with protective shells. These amniotic eggs could survive on land, shielding embryos from drying out. It was a breakthrough that freed vertebrates from the water's edge. Reptiles could lay their eggs in forests and uplands, colonizing places amphibians never could. The earliest reptiles were small and lizard-like, but their innovation would prove world-changing. In time, reptiles would diversify into countless forms, from sail-backed predators like Dimetrodon to the ancestors of dinosaurs, birds, and mammals. But in the Carboniferous and Permian periods, they were just beginning, competing with amphibians for dominance in the forests and swamps. The interactions between these groups shaped the ecosystems of the time. Giant arthropods fed on decaying plant matter, recycling nutrients. Insects and smaller arthropods became prey for amphibians and reptiles. Amphibians hunted in wetlands, while reptiles explored drier habitats. It was a complex interwoven system, with life testing its limits in every direction. What would it have been like to walk through one of those forests? The ground would be damp, buzzing with the hum of insects far larger than any alive today. The air would feel heavy, rich in oxygen, perhaps more stimulating than we're used to. Enormous dragonflies darted overhead, their wings catching the light. Giant millipedes rustled in the undergrowth. Amphibians splashed into pools at your approach, their wide eyes watching warily. Reptiles scuttled between roots, quick and alert. It would have been alien, yet strangely familiar, the first version of the land ecosystems we know. These giant creatures didn't last forever. As oxygen levels declined toward the end of the Carboniferous, their advantage disappeared. By the Permian, arthropods had shrunk closer to the sizes we recognize today. Amphibians, too, declined as reptiles expanded into new niches. The giants of the Carboniferous were a product of their unique environment. a brief window when conditions allowed life to stretch its boundaries. But their legacy was lasting. The early experiments of arthropods, amphibians and reptiles laid the groundwork for future ecosystems. Insects became the most diverse group of animals on Earth. Amphibians, though diminished, still survive as frogs, salamanders and caecilians. Reptiles became the ancestors of dinosaurs, birds and mammals. The Carboniferous giants may be gone, but the evolutionary paths they started continue. In many ways, this was the moment when land truly became alive in all its dimensions. Plants had already transformed the atmosphere and soils, but with animals exploring forests, wetlands and skies, the land became dynamic, noisy and complex. Predator-prey relationships evolved, food webs expanded, ecosystems stabilized. The testing of land by these early giants was not just a phase. It was the beginning of modern terrestrial life. And as these ecosystems matured, the continents themselves were continuing their restless drift, moving ever closer to the moment when they would gather into Pangea. The stage was being set for a world where life and land would meet on a scale larger than ever before. To understand what it means for continents to collide, you have to scale up your imagination. We know collisions today, India pushing into Asia to raise the Himalayas, Africa slowly moving toward Europe to close the Mediterranean, but these are only fragments of what Earth has done in the past. Before Pangea, there were other collisions, older unions of land that were not just regional mountain building events, but global cataclysms, the kind that stitched entire continents into supercontinents. Every time it happened, the face of Earth was changed, and the living world was reshaped along with it. The collisions began with smaller pieces, cratons, those ancient cores of rock that had survived for billions of years drifted slowly across oceans. Carried by tectonic plates, they approached one another, guided by subduction zones that consumed the seas between them. When they finally met, the crust buckled. Mountains rose. Earthquakes rippled through the land. Volcanic arcs erupted in chains along the suture zones. These collisions didn't happen in days or years, but in spans of tens of millions of years. From the human perspective, they were unimaginably slow, but in geologic time they were sudden, decisive events. The assembly of Nuna around 1.8 billion years ago was one of the first examples we can identify. Smaller continental blocks converged, joining into a landmass that stretched across a significant portion of Earth's surface. The scars of those collisions are still visible in ancient mountain belts preserved in Canada, Greenland and Siberia. Rodinia's formation about 1.1 billion years ago followed a similar pattern, with cratons welding together through massive orogenies, mountain-building events that raised ranges as high as anything on Earth today. Though those mountains are long eroded, their roots remain, crystalline rocks marking where continents once slammed together. When continents collided, the results were more than just topography. Collisions reorganized climate by creating mountain chains that blocked winds and altered rainfall. They changed ocean circulation by closing seas and forcing currents into new paths. They reshaped ecosystems, flooding shallow seas and opening new habitats even as they destroyed others. In the deep past, before animals had colonized land, the biological impact was felt mostly in the oceans, where nutrient delivery from new mountains fueled microbial blooms and shifts in chemistry. Later, as forests and animals spread across continents, collisions transformed entire ecosystems on land as well. One of the most dramatic collisions came during the late Paleozoic, when Gondwana from the south and Laurussia from the north drifted together. Their impact around 335 million years ago created Pangea, the supercontinent most of us know by name. The collision closed the Reich Ocean, raised mountain belts like the Appalachians and the Variscan Range, and reshaped the distribution of climates worldwide. Deserts spread in the vast continental interior, while swampy forests thrived along equatorial belts. Pangea's creation was one of Earth's greatest collisions, but it was only the latest in a long series stretching back billions of years. To stand in the middle of such a collision, if that were possible, would have been awe-inspiring. Imagine a coastline slowly disappearing as another landmass approached, volcanic eruptions darkening the sky, the ground trembling as subduction zones consumed oceanic crust, rivers redirected as mountains rose in their path. None of it happened overnight, but the cumulative effect over generations would have been unmistakable. What had once been an ocean horizon would, in time, be blocked by rising peaks. The human sense of catastrophe doesn't quite apply, because for early life, these changes were simply new conditions to adapt to. Trilobites, brachiopods, and corals shifted with the seas. Amphibians and reptiles spread across the new forests and plains. Life always found ways to adjust, but for the planet, each collision was a restructuring, a moment when the map was redrawn and the rules of climate and environment rewritten. The idea that supercontinents are born of collisions also means they are temporary. Just as collisions close oceans, later rifting opens them again. The same mountains that rose in triumph are worn down by erosion, their sediments carried to new seas. It is an endless cycle, and collisions are only one half of it. But they are the half that leaves the most visible scars. The granite roots of mountains, the folded belts of rock, the sutures where ancient continents fused. Scientists trace these collisions by matching rocks across now distant lands. The Appalachians in North America line up with mountains in Scotland and Norway, showing where continents once joined. The geology of West Africa matches that of northeastern South America, a reminder of their union in Gondwana. These connections allow us to reconstruct the lost geography of supercontinents, revealing the cataclysms that joined them. And with every collision came fire. Subduction zones fueled volcanic arcs. As plates jammed together, magma welled up, creating igneous intrusions that hardened into new rocks. The chemistry of the atmosphere shifted as gases poured out. Collisions were not quiet events. They were fiery, trembling, world-shaping. The birth of a supercontinent was never just a matter of land pressing against land. It was the culmination of countless forces: mantle convection, plate motion, erosion, volcanism, all converging. And every time, the world that emerged looked different from the one before. New mountains, new climates, new oceans, new ecosystems. Thinking about these collisions reminds us of how dynamic Earth has always been. The continents we take for granted are not eternal. They have been torn apart and slammed back together many times, and each collision was both an ending and a beginning. The end of one ocean, the beginning of a new land. From these cataclysms came stability too. The thickened crust of collisional belts formed the stable cores of continents, cratons that could endure for billions of years. The land beneath our feet owes its permanence to the violence of those ancient unions. And as we trace the story of collisions, we naturally find ourselves approaching the most famous of them all, the final assembly of Pangea. But before that, we should pause to look closely at Gondwana itself, the southern giant that played such a central role in bringing the pieces together. Throughout Earth's history, change has usually come from within. Continents drift, volcanoes erupt, mountains rise, seas open and close. But every so often, the forces of the cosmos intervene. Asteroids and comets, icy and rocky fragments wandering the solar system, have struck Earth again and again, sometimes with little effect, sometimes with consequences so profound that entire ecosystems collapsed. Before the age of dinosaurs, long before Pangea fully broke apart, there were impacts that reshaped the trajectory of life, reminders that Earth is not an isolated world but part of a larger, restless system. When we look up at the moon, we see the record of those visitors in craters frozen forever into its surface. Earth was struck just as often, if not more, but here weathering, erosion and tectonics have erased most of the scars. Still, a few ancient impact structures survive, preserved enough for us to study. They tell us that long before dinosaurs, before mammals, even before forests, cosmic collisions were shaping the story of our planet. One of the oldest known impact craters is the Vredefort structure in South Africa, formed about 2 billion years ago. The impactor may have been more than 10 kilometers wide, releasing energy equivalent to billions of nuclear bombs. It excavated a crater more than 300 kilometers across, dwarfing any modern city. Though life at the time was still microbial, the effects would have been dramatic. Shockwaves ripping across the surface, molten rock raining down, global climate jolted by dust and gases thrown into the air. Another colossal impact occurred about 1.85 billion years ago in what is now Sudbury, Canada. The Sudbury Basin stretches over 200 kilometres, one of the largest confirmed impact sites on Earth. The collision melted rock, forming pools of magma that later cooled into valuable deposits of nickel, copper and platinum. In this case, the cosmic visitor not only reshaped the land, but also created resources that billions of years later, humans would mine and depend on. By the time multicellular life was spreading in the oceans, the planet was still vulnerable to these strikes. Around 600 million years ago, during the Ediacaran period, an asteroid impact in what is now Australia may have disrupted ecosystems, though evidence is fragmentary. Later, during the Cambrian and Ordovician periods, Earth was struck repeatedly. Craters from this time survive in places like Sweden, Canada, and the United States. Most were regional events, devastating locally but not globally. Yet they were constant reminders that life evolved in a dangerous neighbourhood. But some impacts were more than regional. Around 465 million years ago, during the Ordovician period, Earth passed through a cloud of debris created by the collision of two large asteroids in the asteroid belt. Fragments rained down for millions of years, creating dozens of craters across the globe. Some scientists suggest this bombardment may have contributed to environmental changes that helped trigger the Ordovician-Silurian mass extinction, one of the earliest great die-offs in Earth's history. The Ordovician extinction, about 444 million years ago, eliminated roughly 85% of marine species. It's usually attributed to global cooling and falling sea levels, likely tied to glaciations in Gondwana. But impacts may have played a role as well, compounding stresses on ecosystems already struggling to adapt. Trilobites, brachiopods, and reef builders were among the casualties, reshaping marine communities for millions of years to come. Later, during the Devonian period, impact again coincided with crisis. The Devonian saw some of the greatest evolutionary innovations in Earth's history. Fish diversifying, plants colonising land, amphibians taking their first steps. But it ended with a prolonged series of extinctions between 375 and 360 million years ago. The causes are debated: climate fluctuations, ocean anoxia, volcanic eruptions. Yet impacts may have contributed as well. Craters from this time have been found in North America and elsewhere, suggesting that Earth was again struck as ecosystems teetered. The late Devonian extinctions hit marine life especially hard. Reefs collapsed, never again reaching the same diversity until tens of millions of years later. Placoderm fish, once dominant, declined and disappeared. The survivors included early sharks, bony fish, and the ancestors of tetrapods, creatures that would eventually give rise to amphibians, reptiles, and mammals. As with other mass extinctions, destruction cleared the way for new groups to rise. Not every cosmic visitor brought catastrophe. Smaller impacts were part of the background of Earth's environment, occasional jolts that disturbed but did not destroy. In fact, impacts may have played a constructive role in the earliest history of life. Some scientists argue that impacts delivered water and organic molecules to the young Earth, seeding the ingredients for biology. Others suggest that the energy of impacts created environments where complex chemistry could flourish. In this sense, Cosmic visitors were both destroyers and potential midwives of life. Still, the record shows that impacts could be devastating when conditions aligned. Dust thrown into the atmosphere could block sunlight for years, collapsing photosynthesis and chilling the planet. Fires ignited by re-entering debris could sweep across continents. Shockwaves could trigger earthquakes and tsunamis on a global scale. Even without humans to witness them, these events were world-changing. As Earth moved closer to the time of Pangea, impacts remained part of the story. Around 300 million years ago, during the late Carboniferous, the Woodley impact in Australia left a crater nearly 120 kilometres wide. In the early Permian, the Araguaina crater in Brazil formed about 40 kilometres across, releasing vast amounts of energy. Though not as catastrophic as later events like the Chicxulub impact that ended the age of dinosaurs, these collisions were still powerful enough to reshape local environments and perhaps contribute to broader ecological stress. What's striking is how impacts and Earth's own cycles often intertwined. Mass extinctions were rarely caused by a single factor. Instead, they were the result of multiple stresses: volcanism, climate change, sea level shifts, and sometimes impacts, all combining to push ecosystems past their limits. Cosmic visitors were not constant executioners, but when they arrived at the wrong time, they could tip the balance. To imagine one of these events is to imagine a day unlike any other. A bright point in the sky growing rapidly, then splitting the air with a shockwave hotter and louder than anything imaginable. Forests igniting, seas lifting into tsunamis, dust and ash spreading across the globe, the impact itself lasting only moments, but its consequences echoing for thousands or millions of years. Before the age of dinosaurs, these cosmic events helped shape the path of evolution. They cleared ecosystems, opened niches, and sometimes pushed survivors in new directions. Without them, the history of life might have been slower, more uniform, less punctuated by bursts of change. And as Earth endured its visitors from space, its own internal rhythms continued. Continents drifted, oceans closed, volcanoes erupted. The long road toward Pangea pressed on, with landmasses inching closer, drawn by the same tectonic forces that had always driven the supercontinent cycle. The story of Pangea is often told as if it appeared suddenly, a great continent rising out of the sea in a single sweep of tectonic destiny. But the truth is slower, messier, and more fascinating. The road to Pangea stretched across hundreds of millions of years, a journey of collisions and separations, of oceans opening and closing, of mountain ranges rising and eroding away again. The continents that would eventually come together were once scattered across the globe, drifting along their own paths, guided by the deep currents of Earth's mantle. Their convergence was not inevitable in any conscious sense, but it was the natural outcome of the processes that have always driven the planet. To begin that long road, we have to look back to the time after Rodinia, when that earlier supercontinent began to fragment around 750 million years ago. Its breakup created new oceans, among them Merovia, which surrounded the landmass, and later the Iapetus, which opened between what would become North America, Europe, and parts of South America. The pieces of Rodinia drifted apart, and for tens of millions of years the world was a patchwork of smaller continents and island arcs. This scattering set the stage for the next great assembly. As time passed, the fragments began to regroup. Laurentia, the ancient core of North America, drifted across the equator. Baltica, the forerunner of northern Europe, moved slowly toward it. Avalonia, a smaller piece including parts of modern-day Europe, also wandered in their direction. To the south lay Gondwana, a vast landmass made up of South America, Africa, Antarctica, Australia, and the Indian subcontinent. Gondwana was already immense, and in time it would serve as the anchor around which the rest of the continents gathered. The closure of the Iapetus Ocean was one of the key steps along this road. As Laurentia, Baltica, and Avalonia converged, the ocean between them narrowed. Subduction zones consumed its floor, pulling the continents together. Their collisions around 400 million years ago raised mountain belts that stretched across what is now North America and Europe. The Caledonian Mountains in Scandinavia and the Northern Appalachians in the eastern United States are remnants of this great convergence. Meanwhile, Gondwana was moving northward. Its collision with Euramerica, the combined Laurentia, Baltica and Avalonia, was not quick. It took tens of millions of years, during which smaller oceans like the Race gradually closed. Volcanic arcs flared, earthquakes shook coastlines, and seas disappeared beneath the advancing land. Around 335 million years ago, Gondwana and Euramerica finally collided, stitching together the heart of Pangea. The Appalachians in North America, the Variscan Belt in Europe, and the Mauritanidy Belt in Africa all record this massive union, but the convergence wasn't finished. Siberia, another large craton, lingered to the northeast, separated from Pangea by the Ural Ocean. Over millions of years it drifted closer, and around 300 million years ago it collided with the eastern edge of the growing supercontinent. The collision raised the Ural Mountains, which still stand today as a reminder of that final step. With Siberia welded to the whole, Pangea was complete. A single supercontinent stretching from pole to pole, surrounded by the global ocean panther Lhasa and the smaller Tethys to the east. This slow, grinding road to Pangea was more than just a rearrangement of geography. It transformed climate, ecosystems, and life itself. The union of continents created an interior so vast that it was cut off from the moderating influence of the sea. Deserts spread across what is now North America, North Africa, and Asia. Monsoons raged along the coasts. Mountain belts altered wind and rainfall patterns, creating regional climates that shaped evolution. For plants and animals, the convergence of land meant new opportunities and new challenges. Species that had evolved separately on scattered continents suddenly found themselves neighbours, forced to compete, adapt, or vanish. Swampy forests thrived along equatorial belts, giving rise to the great coal deposits of the Carboniferous. Amphibians and reptiles spread across the forests and deserts, diversifying into forms that would dominate the Permian period. The convergence also played a role in extinctions. As seas closed and shallow, marine habitats vanished, many marine species declined. Reefs, which had flourished during the Devonian, collapsed under the stresses of changing oceans and climates. Mass extinctions marked the Devonian and later the Permian, each tied in part to the tectonic shifts that accompanied the assembly of Pangea. If you could watch the process on a time-lapse globe, the beauty of it would be striking. Continents drifting like rafts, slowly converging, oceans narrowing, mountain ranges flaring up at collision zones, deserts spreading across interiors. The road to Pangea was not a straight path, but a dance, sometimes advancing, sometimes retreating, always guided by forces deep within the earth. Geologists reconstruct this road through the evidence left behind. Paleomagnetic data tells us where continents sat in ancient latitudes. Fossil distributions show which lands were once joined. Mountain belts and suture zones reveal the scars of collisions. When the pieces are assembled, the picture of continents slowly converging comes into focus, and the inevitability of Pangea emerges. But inevitability doesn't mean finality. Just as earlier supercontinents had formed and broken apart, so too would Pangea eventually rift. After reaching its maximum extent around 250 million years ago, cracks began to appear. New oceans opened, and the great landmass divided again into the pieces we know today. The road to Pangea was long, but it was only one segment of an endless cycle. Thinking about this convergence helps us see Earth not as static, but as constantly in motion. The continents we know are only temporary arrangements, caught in a phase of a cycle billions of years old. Pangea was one such phase, monumental but transient. Before it came Rodinia and Nuna, After it will come Pangea Proxima or some other future configuration. And as the continents finally gathered, as the long road of collisions and closures brought them into one, the world that emerged was both familiar and alien. Familiar because forests, rivers and animals spread across it. Alien because its scale and unity were unlike anything we know today. The long road to Pangea leads naturally into reflection. What was this world like, standing complete and immense before it began its slow disintegration into the continents we now inhabit? When we think of the world, we usually imagine the map we know. Continents outlined in familiar shapes, oceans stretching between them, climates that seem natural to us, only because they are the ones we were born into. But Earth has worn many faces, and most of them would have been unrecognisable to us. Long before Pangea, before the dinosaurs, before mammals or humans, the planet carried arrangements of land and sea that seem strange now. But they were just as real, just as vibrant. Each supercontinent and vanished ocean, each ancient forest and barren shore, was a world in its own right. To look back at them is to realise that the Earth we know is only one temporary version, one page in a much longer book. Those earlier faces of Earth remind us of how changeable the planet is. Continents are not fixed, they wander. Oceans are not permanent, they open and close. Climates are not steady, they swing between ice and fire. Even the air itself has shifted from methane haze to oxygen-rich clarity. What we see today is not the end of a process, only a moment within it. The continents we know will drift again. Oceans will vanish and be reborn. Climates will swing to extremes we cannot imagine. Earth has always been dynamic, and it always will be. There is something humbling in that perspective. We often treat the present world as normal, as if its arrangement is the natural order. But normal is an illusion. For most of Earth's history there was no Atlantic Ocean, no Sahara Desert, no Himalayas. There were instead seas like Iapetus and Tethys, mountains that have long since eroded away, forests of lycophytes and giant horsetails instead of oaks and pines. What feels permanent to us is only temporary in geological time. The lessons of those earlier worlds are not only about geography, but also about life. Every supercontinent cycle brought both destruction and opportunity. Collisions raised mountains and closed seas, wiping out habitats, but they also created new landscapes where life could diversify. Climate shifts caused extinctions, but they also opened niches for new groups to flourish. The rise of oxygen nearly extinguished anaerobic life, but it also made possible animals like us. Earth's history shows again and again that change is not optional. It is the very condition of life. Consider the first forests. Their spread transformed the atmosphere, drawing down carbon dioxide and raising oxygen. They cooled the climate, perhaps triggering ice ages, and they created habitats for insects, amphibians, and reptiles. The world before forests would have felt stark and barren by comparison. Yet once forests appeared, they reshaped everything. Or think of the oceans before Pangea, filled with trilobites, anomalocarids, straight-shelled cephalopods, and armoured fish. Those creatures are gone, but their time was no less vivid. Each vanished ecosystem was once the normal world for the life that inhabited it. The faces of Earth also remind us of resilience. Life endured snowball Earth, when glaciers reached the equator. It endured the greenhouse worlds, when heat and storms seemed relentless. It endured impacts from space, volcanic eruptions on continental scales, and mass extinctions that erased most of what was alive. Each time, life survived, adapted, and reinvented itself. We are here because of that resilience, because microbes, plants, and animals before us found ways through crises we cannot fully fathom. And yet, the faces of Earth also show fragility. Ecosystems flourished for millions of years only to collapse when climates shifted or oceans closed. Groups that once dominated trilobites, placoderms, giant arthropods, vanished forever. The world has no obligation to keep any particular form of life. Survival depends on adaptation, and even the most successful creatures can disappear if conditions change too quickly. If we could walk across those ancient faces, what would we feel? On Ur, the tiny proto-continent, we would see barren rock washed by microbial films, silent and alien. On Rodinia, we might stand in deserts under strange skies, with shallow seas lapping against shores filled with simple life. In the Devonian forests, we would hear the rustle of leaves and the hum of insects the size of birds, a world alive but strange. On the road to Pangea, we would watch deserts spread across vast interiors, while swamps at the equator buzzed with amphibians and reptiles. Each face of Earth had its own moods, its own rhythms, its own beauty. What ties them together is the cycle. Continents gather, break apart, and gather again. Oceans open and close. Climates swing. Life diversifies, collapses, and diversifies again. The cycle has no final chapter, only repetition in new forms. Just as Pangea eventually split into the continents we know, the lands of today will someday reunite into a future supercontinent. It may form in the Pacific, closing that ocean, or in the Atlantic, or in some configuration we cannot predict. But it will form, and Earth will wear another new face. For us, these reflections matter not because we will see that future supercontinent, but because they remind us of perspective. Our lives are brief, our civilizations fleeting compared to the timescales of continents and oceans. Yet we live on land that has been through it all, rock that once lay at the bottom of vanished seas, mountains built in collisions long past, soils formed in ancient forests. The ground beneath our feet carries the memory of every earlier Earth. When you look at a map, it is tempting to see permanence, but look deeper, and you see motion. The Atlantic is widening, the Pacific is narrowing, Africa is moving north, Australia is drifting. Every line on the map is temporary. The continents we teach children to memorize will not be the same in the far future. They are only today's arrangement, today's world. And when you look at the sky, remember it too has changed. It was once orange with methane haze, then blue with oxygen, then filtered by ozone that allowed life onto land. Even the air we breathe is not eternal. It was made for us by forests and oceans, and it will change again in the deep future. To reflect on the worlds before us is to see that Earth is both fragile and enduring, both temporary and eternal. Its faces change, but the planet remains. Its life shifts, but the story continues. We are one more chapter in that long narrative, one more set of creatures adapting to the conditions of our time. And perhaps that is the lesson of looking back before Pangea. Not that the past was alien, though it was, but that change is the constant. Earth has never been what it is for long. It will not remain what it is now for long either. But in every face it has worn, there has been beauty, resilience, and life finding its way. And so here we are, back in our own time, after wandering through faces of the earth long gone. We've followed drifting continents, oceans that opened and closed, skies that shifted from suffocating haze to oxygen-rich blue. We've walked among the first forests, seen giant insects buzzing in the shadows, watched the slow march toward Pangea, and looked up as cosmic visitors reshaped the story of life. The ground beneath us, the air we breathe, even the map we know, all of it is temporary, all of it a moment in an unbroken rhythm. If you've stayed with me through this journey, thank you. It's strange to think that something as familiar as the planet beneath our feet can also be so fleeting, that every coastline we know is only passing through. But that strangeness is part of the wonder. When you step outside tomorrow, take a second to look at the sky, or touch the ground, or listen to the wind. They're all carrying pieces of that deeper history, stories older than forests, older than animals, older than Pangea itself. And if you found this gentle walk through time soothing or interesting or maybe even sleep-worthy, you can always join me again. There are still more questions to ask, more forgotten worlds to visit, more pieces of Earth's story waiting quietly to be told. Until next time, wherever you are, whatever hour it is, may you rest easy knowing that even in its endless changes the Earth keeps turning, the continents keep drifting, and the story continues.